फाउंडेशन द्वारा आयोजित रजा पर्व का ये आखिरी दिन है और आज हमारे बीच वक्ता जो मौजूद हैं वो रंग संवाद पर बात करेंगे। कुमार शाहनी जो प्रख्यात फिल्म मेकर हैं, पीयूष शाह जो सिनेमेटोग्राफी के लिए मशहूर हैं, बनवंती जी जो शांति निकेतन में पढ़ाती हैं, बनतन और छत्रपति दत्ता गवर्नमेंट फाइनेंस कॉलेज के प्रिंसिपल हैं और चित्रकार हैं, सुधाकर यादव जो चित्रकार हैं। तो हम सब लोगों के बीच इन सब का स्वागत है और रंग संवाद रंग पर बात होगी और रजा साहब के जो रंग हैं वो हम सब जानते ही हैं कि
इसका नाम वर्ण संवाद,
वर्ण संवाद कि वे अनूठे रंग प्रयोग के लिए जाने जाते हैं। और सबसे पहले मेरा परिचय रंगों से अगर हुआ था तो 1978 में यहाँ एक प्रदर्शनी लगी थी कला परिषद में रजा साहब की, और वो हम लोग देखने आए थे फाइन आर्ट्स कॉलेज इंदौर से। उस वक्त हम लोग पढ़ते थे, तो वो रंग देख करके मेरे को एहसास हुआ कि जो रंग है वो माध्यम नहीं है, वो एक तत्व है, जो एक महत्वपूर्ण तत्व की तरह उसको मैंने महसूस किया। उसके बाद से ये कोशिश रही कि मैं रंग उनकी तरह तो न लगा सकूं, मगर रंग लगाने की कोशिश करूं जिसमें उनका लगाया हुआ नीला या उनका लगाया हुआ पीला रंग अक्सर याद रहता था। और वो जो कुछ भी उस वक्त तक की मेरी समझ थी, जो कि रंग को लेकर के बिल्कुल नहीं थी, हम लोग कॉलेज में जो पढ़ते थे और जो पढ़ाया जाता था उसी के अनुसार रंगों का इस्तेमाल करते थे। तो जब मैंने इस तरह से कोशिश करना शुरू करी तो मुझे पता लगा कि रंग लगाना आसान नहीं है। तो उस वक्त हमारे घर में सभी चित्रकार आया करते थे और तो उनसे मैंने पूछना शुरू करा कि कैसे रंग लगाया जाए, एक चटक रंग कैसे लगाया जाए। तो जाहिर है सबके जवाब बहुत ही एक दूसरे से विपरीत थे। उसमें डीजे जोशी भी होते थे, विष्णु चिंचालकर, मिर्जा इस्माइल बेग, शहर के जितने भी मतलब कलाकार होते थे वे आया करते थे। तो मेरे पिता के एक स्टूडेंट थे धवल क्लांत, उन्होंने मुझसे कहा कि अगर तुम रंग समझना चाहते हो तो 4-6 महीने काले रंग में काम करो। तो लगभग मैंने 10 साल सिर्फ काले रंग में काम किया और उसके बाद रंगों की तरफ लौटा। तो ये जो रंग का एक असर हुआ वो दूसरी तरह से हुआ। और जहाँ से मैं आता हूँ इंदौर, वो एक मध्य प्रदेश का कमर्शियल सिटी है, व्यापार वहाँ बहुत होता है, तो वहाँ व्यापारी बहुत हैं। तो उनमें से एक किसी के घर हर साल वो दिवाली पे उनके देवी देवताओं की आँख नाक बनाने वो मेरे को बुलाया करते थे। तो मैंने देखा कि वो सारे लोग हरे को नीला और नीले को हरा बोलते हैं। तो मेरे लिए बड़ा एक कठिन वो हो गया, क्योंकि अगर हम देखें तो हमारे ऊपर दो रंगों का बड़ा अदृश्य प्रभाव होता है। एक हरा जो वेजिटेशन चारों तरफ बिखरा हुआ है, और दूसरा नीला आसमान जो सारे समय आपके सर पे रहता है। तो अब ये जो वेजिटेशन है वो नीला अगर हो तो वो कैसा हो, और ये जो आसमान है वो हरा हो तो कैसा हो। तो ये एक दुविधा मेरे मन में रही कि भाई रंगों को ऐसे कैसे पहचाना जा रहा है। और फिर बाद में मैंने एक शागाल का इंटरव्यू देखा, आखिरी इंटरव्यू था उनका, तो उसमें वो बता रहे थे कि जब मैंने पहली बार नीला पेड़ बनाया तो सब लोगों ने कहा कि नीला तो होता नहीं पेड़, और मैंने जीवन भर नीला पेड़ बनाया और आज सारे लोग नीला पेड़ मांगते हैं मुझसे। तो ये भी एक मसला था जिसमें शागाल जो है अपने हर एक को नीला पेंट कर रहे थे। फिर इस प्रोसेस में मैंने ये भी देखा कि रंग जो है वो आपको मुसीबत में भी डालते हैं और अचंभे की तरह प्रकट भी होते हैं, और आपको पता नहीं होता है कि किस रंग के भीतर कौन सा एक दूसरा रंग छुपा हुआ है। तो वो जब आप काम करते हैं तब आपको वो अचानक प्रकट होता है अपने दूसरे रंग में, दूसरे स्वभाव में। तो आपके लिए वो एक अचंभा रहता है कि ये तो कभी हमने सोचा ना था कि एक ऑरेंज कलर के भीतर एक भूरा रंग छिपा हुआ है, और ये जो उसका भूरा प्रकट हो रहा है वो किसी एक संदर्भ में ही प्रकट हो रहा है, ऐसे नहीं वो दिखाई देता है। ऐसे ही कभी कोई ब्लू कलर है, उसके अंदर भी ग्रे छुपा हुआ है, तो जब 2 ब्लू लगाने के बाद तीसरा ब्लू मैंने उसके ऊपर लगाया तो पता चला कि वो ग्रे हो गया। तो अगर आप देखें तो वो लगेगा कि मैंने ग्रे कलर लगाया हुआ है, मगर वो शुद्ध नीला रंग है। तो इसी में मैंने बहुत सारे जो म्यूजियम देखे और बहुत सारे काम देखने का मौका मिला, तो मैंने पाया कि लेमन येलो एक ऐसा रंग है जिसको लगाने से सभी चित्रकार बचते हैं। किसी भी बड़े चित्रकार द्वारा लेमन येलो कभी भी मैंने लगाया हुआ नहीं दिखा। बहुत ढूंढने पर उसमें मेरे को 3 कलाकृतियां मिलती हैं, एक मकबूल फिदा हुसैन की, एक रजा साहब की और एक स्वामीनाथन की, जिसमें उन्होंने प्योर लेमन येलो लगाया है। वो इतना मुश्किल कलर है कि उसको लगाने में आर्टिस्ट हमेशा ही सफल नहीं होता, और वो उसमें सफ़ेद मिला के कुछ अलग रंग बना देगा या कुछ और टोन पैदा कर देगा, और वो लेमन येलो से बच जाता है। और इन तीनों ने भी सिर्फ एक ही कलाकृति में एक ही बार लगाया, दोबारा फिर अटेम्प्ट नहीं किया। तो ये भी एक है कि वो रंग एक मुश्किल रंग है। तो ये इन रंगों की दुनिया में हम संवाद शुरू करते हैं। तो मैं सुधाकर यादव को बुलाता हूँ, वे आके अपनी बातें हैं।
ये रजा पर्व के दरमियान ये 2 जो सेमिनार रखे हैं कल और आज के, एक्चुअली ये बड़ा मुश्किल है क्योंकि ये फंडामेंटल है। खाली आकार के ऊपर बात करना है, खाली कलर के ऊपर बात करना है। तो ये जो जिम्मेदारी पेंटिंग के ऊपर बात करनी है तो सभी फंडामेंट के साथ साथ कंटेंट और फॉर्म के साथ साथ कलर के साथ साथ बात हो सकती है, लेकिन ये बड़ा मुश्किल है। जैसा बेसिक फॉर्म के ऊपर बात करना है तो बेसिक के सिवा हम छोड़ नहीं सकते ज़्यादा एरिया। बेसिक के साथ खेलना ही मुश्किल है। हम त्रिकोणा बोले या त्रिभुज बोले, वाणी बदल देती है, उसका आशय भी बदल देता है, बस इतना को खेल सकते हैं। तो जब से मुझे एक इन्विटेशन मिला वर्ण के ऊपर बात करना है तो बड़ा मुश्किल है। हर एक पेंटर ने पेंटिंग में ही काम किया है, कलर में ही काम कर दिया है, और आजू बाजू में देखते हैं ऑल ऑब्जेक्ट ऑलरेडी पेंटेड है। पेंटेड ऑब्जेक्ट से देखकर ही हम पेंटिंग बना देते हैं। जैसा अभी अखिलेश ने बोला नीला आकाश है, हाँ सभी देखते हैं। जो पेंटर नहीं वो भी देखते हैं, जो देखते वो भी देखते हैं। पेंटर ज़्यादा सोचता है, क्या सोचता है वो सबकी अपनी अपनी कल्पना है, अपना अपना सेंसिबिलिटी है कि कलर को वो कैसे फील करें। और कलर भी बहुत मुश्किल है। इसका टाइटल ही है कि वर्ण संवाद, रंग संवाद नहीं है। शब्द में बहुत अलग अलग डायमेंशन के आशय होते रहते हैं। मैं वर्ण को थोड़ा अपनी तरफ से देखता हूं कि वर्ण एक ऐसा शब्द है जो बहुत आर्ट फॉर्म को इन्वाइट करते रहता है। जैसा वर्ण से वर्णन करते हैं तो लिटरेचर के ऊपर इशारा बन जाता है उसका, वर्ण से चित्रण करते हैं तो कला के ऊपर चला जाता है। तो वर्ण लोक भाषा में, सामान्य भाषा में हमेशा शब्द यूज करते रहते हैं, इसका वर्ण कैसा है, उसका वर्ण कैसा है। हम बोलते कि तेरा रंग मैंने देखा, वो किस रंग के संकेत से नहीं बोलते हैं, मानस शास्त्रीय संकेत से ही बोलते हो। लेकिन जब पेंटर के सामने कलर आता है, ऐसा नहीं होता कि वो एक कलर से सेटिस्फाइड हो, समाधानी हो, उसकी अभिव्यक्ति एक कलर से है, हमेशा कलर चेंज करते रहते हैं। जैसा मास्टर पेंटर पिकासो में हम कभी कभी कलर कैसे उसका युग बोलते हैं कि पिंक पीरियड था, ये पीरियड था, तो ये कलर कहाँ से आते हैं? तो मुझे लगता है कि जो हम मैक्सिमम कलर के बारे में ज्यादा सोचते हैं वो सरफेस के कलर के बारे में सोचते हैं, लेकिन बेसिकली कलर स्पेस में होते हैं। बट कलर ट्रांसफर फ्रॉम स्पेस टू सरफेस, थ्योरी बदल जाती है पूरी। जितना साइंटिफिक एनालिसिस हो चुका है वो स्पेस के कलर के बारे में बात की, और हम गलती से समझते कि अरे उसने कलर के बारे में बात की है, लेकिन कलर में पिगमेंट के बारे में बात नहीं की है, स्पेस के कलर के बारे में बात की। तो पहले मुझे बहुत ही उसको अंडरलाइन करना मुझे अच्छा लगता है। नॉट ओनली मैं पर्सनली किसी पेंटर की बात तो नहीं करूंगा, क्योंकि पेंटर को भी पता नहीं कि वो कौन से कलर कब कब यूज करेगा और कलर का क्या क्या नाम दे देगा। कलर का कोई नाम नहीं होता है, कलर खाली सेंसिबिलिटी है, एक संवादित है कि जो हम बाजार से लाते हैं वो तो कलर नहीं होता है, कलर बनाना पड़ता है। दैट इज पिगमेंट जो बाजार से लाते हैं। इंडस्ट्रियल प्रोडक्ट है, कोई कैमल कंपनी अपना लेबल लगा लगा कर बेचती रहती है। हम आते ही पेंटिंग पे वो नहीं लगते, हम उसके ऊपर संस्कार करते हैं अपनी तरफ से। वो पिगमेंट है, पैलेट पे वो निकाल देते हैं, पॉसिबिलिटीज देखते हैं कि क्या 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 मुझे पेंट करने में हेल्प करेगा, और देन उसके संस्कार शुरू होते हैं। इसको उसमें मिक्स करो, उसमें इसको मिक्स करो, उसमें मिक्स करते रहो, और वो खरी कलर है। तो पिगमेंट को हम कलर में बनाते हैं, तो पैलेट में आता है तो कलर बन जाता है, तो सरफेस पे जाता है तो उसकी अभिव्यक्ति हो जाती है। उस टाइम भी वो कलर का नाम नहीं होता, क्योंकि एक कलर नहीं है, एक कलर होना दूसरा कलर डिसाइड करता है कि ये कलर है। ये जो लोनली है वो तो एक अंग है, कहीं हमको दिखा रहा है, वो रंग नहीं है। जो अंग रंग बन जाता है, रंग के साथ दूसरा रंग आता है तो एक अंतरंग बन जाता है जो तुमको छू लेता है, और तुम नहीं बोल सकते कि तुमने क्या बनाया। हम बोलते हैं देखो, क्योंकि तुम्हारा भी अंतरंग या रंग से तैयार होना चाहिए। तो कलर तीन ही है, हम बोलते हैं एकेडमिकली। सॉरी, ये बहुत गलत है, मैं बहुत रिस्पॉन्सिबली बोल रहा हूँ कि इसको मैंने सिखाया है। अभी अखिलेश ने बोला लेमन येलो में कोई पेंटिंग नहीं करता है, एक्चुअली लेमन येलो कलर ही नहीं है, रेड कलर ही नहीं है, ब्लू कलर ही नहीं है। ये कलर बनाने के साधन है, ये बेसिक कलर है। हम लेमन येलो नहीं बना सकते, हम ब्लू नहीं बना सकते, हम रेड नहीं बना सकते, लेकिन हम ऑरेंज बना सकते हैं, हम ग्रीन बना सकते हैं, हम व्हाइट बना सकते हैं। जो बना सकते हैं, जिसका सृजन के लिए हम उसको सिलेक्ट करते हैं, वहां से कलर शुरू हो जाते हैं। जो है वो तो प्राथमिक स्थिति है, एज इट इज इंस्टेंटली जाके लेकर यूज नहीं कर सकते, हमको उसका संस्कार देना पड़ता है, बनाना पड़ता है, तब वो जाके कलर बन जाता है। और उसके बाद एक बात, जब हम आगे चले जाए 3 कलर के बाद, तो सभी शेड्स बनते रहते हैं, और वो शेड्स में तीनों कलर की कम ज्यादा उपलब्धि होती रहती है, और वहां से तुम्हारा इमोशन ट्यूनिंग होते रहता है कि कलर के साथ साथ तुम ये ट्यूनिंग करते रहते हो। तो ये कलर बहुत मिनिमम है, और उसमें पूरी देश में काम कर रहा है। तो पहले पता नहीं जो हिस्टोरिक से लेकर ट्राइबल से लेकर ये कलर नॉलेज तो उनको नहीं है, लेकिन कलर नॉलेज की जरूरत नहीं, सेंसिबिलिटी के साथ वो काम कर रहे हैं। पूरा वार्ली बेल्ट नो यूज ऑफ कलर, लेकिन कलर के लिए उनका अभिव्यक्ति कम नहीं हुई, कोई नरेशन उसमें कम नहीं हुआ है, कोई सिंबलिकली उनको कलर के अभाव से रुकी है, ऐसा नहीं हुआ है। तो कलर एक, मुझे हमेशा लगता है कलर अपने अपने में एक अलंकरण है। कौन सा भी कलर ऐसा दिखा दिया टेम्पटेड करके रहता है, उसका एक अलंकरण है। कलर एक मटेरियल है, उसका अपना एक मैटर है। अब जब पेंटर को यूज करना है तो वो मैटर उसके लिए हेल्पफुल नहीं है, तो पेंटर को चाहिए वो मैटर वो मटेरियल में उसको ट्रांसफर करना पड़ता है, उसके लिए उसको कलर मिक्सिंग करना चाहिए। और कलर मिक्सिंग जो करता है कि उसमें जब कैनवास के ऊपर, पैलेट के ऊपर हम उतर जाते हैं तो वास्तव कलर जो देखे हैं उसके नजीक जाने की कोशिश, या तुम्हारी अपनी कल्पना की कलर सिंबलिज्म, कलर के संकेत, उसको अपनी तरफ खींचने की प्रक्रिया शुरू हो जाती है। और कभी कभी तो फिर थक जाते हैं कि कभी ऐसा नहीं कि एक कैनवास के ऊपर एक ही कलर है, दूसरा कलर तो होता ही है। तो मुझे हमेशा ऐसा लगता है कि ये जो वाद और संवाद की बात चलती है तो दो तो पुरुष चाहिए, दो तो स्टेटमेंट चाहिए, दो तो सवाल चाहिए, एक क्वेश्चन हो एक आंसर हो, तभी तो बात बनेगी। इसीलिए हम उसको एकेडमिक इससे कलर हार्मोनी बोलते हैं, लेकिन नॉट गुड शब्द हो, हार्मोनी नहीं है, वो कलर कंस्ट्रक्शन है या रंग रचना है। जैसा आकार रचते हैं ऐसा रंग भी रचना पड़ता है। कोई आदमी है तो हम उसको नीले पीले कलर में रच सकते हैं कि कलर की और वो आकार की जरूरी नहीं कि वो एक दूसरे आकार और वैसा जैसा ही कलर हो। नीला भी आदमी हो सकता है क्योंकि वो पेंटिंग में एक आदमी है, उसमें पेंट मेजर है, फॉर्म कम है। तो शुरू में मैं थोड़ा वास्तव वस्तु से शुरू करूंगा, देन कलर की तरफ चला जाऊंगा। हम देखते हैं, मीन्स थियोरी ऐसी, एक बात मुझे यहाँ बोलना जरूरी है कि पूरे वर्ल्ड में ट्राइबल से लेकर जितनी अभिव्यक्ति हो चुकी है, जब कलर साइंस डेवलप नहीं हुआ था, साइंस ने कलर के ऊपर कोई स्टेटमेंट नहीं बने थे, ऐसे टाइम में सभी स्पॉन्टेनियसली हम कलर यूज करते हैं। जब न्यूटन के कलर के बारे में स्टेटमेंट आ गए, न्यूटन का प्रकाश का पृथक्करण के बारे में का बाद वो कलर का साइंस आ चुका, तो न्यूटन के पहले और न्यूटन के बाद पूरी वर्ल्ड की पैलेट बदल गई है। क्योंकि इनोसेंटली हो या साइंटिफिकली नहीं हो, लेकिन इतना तो बेसिक नॉलेज आ चुका, अरे येलो और ब्लू मिक्स करने के बाद ग्रीन मिलता है, इतना तो यूनिवर्सली नॉलेज आ चुका सर। उसके पहले तो हमको हरा ही चाहिए था, हमको ये पता नहीं था कि येलो और ब्लू मिक्स करना चाहिए। हम कलर को नाम ही लेते थे, हरा कलर दे तो उसके तरफ नारंगी कलर दे दो, लेकिन उसकी उत्पत्ति कैसी हो पता नहीं किया। और न्यूटन के इससे सभी एकेडमी ने वो थियोरी पकड़ ली, और आज तक जितने कलर्स कॉलेज में सिखाते हैं वो स्पेस के कलर है, न्यूटन के कलर है, पेंटर के कलर नहीं सिखा देते। बट एक ही बात हुई, द स्पेस के कलर सरफेस पे आ गए। नेचुरली दोनों सिस्टम डिफरेंट है। स्पेस जैसा वैक्यूम में, वहां पे उसमें कुछ भी आधार नहीं कलर को कहीं रोकने का, और प्रकाश के आधार से आता है। लेकिन कलर जब सरफेस आ गया तो प्रकाश के आधार से नहीं, अपने तेज के आधार से आ गए। तो कलर का अपना एक तेज है, कलर का अपना एक प्रकाश है। वही भी पेंटर को पता चला कि कलर का अपना भी एक प्रकाश रहता है, और वो प्रकाश का, वो तेज का इंटेंसिटी कम ज़्यादा करने के लिए हम कलर के साथ साथ खेलते रहते। तो आफ्टर न्यूटन, बिफोर न्यूटन, ये जो वर्ल्ड पेंटर की जो पैलेट बदल गई है बिकॉज ऑफ दिस साइंस। उसके बाद दूसरा एक साइंस ने बहुत ही इंपॉर्टेंट नॉलेज दिया पूरे वर्ल्ड पेंटर के लिए। तब एक ऐसी चर्चा चल रही थी, जो प्रकाश है ये लहर से बनता है या कण-कण से बनता है। तो पता चला एक प्रकाश में भी 7 कलर के कण होते हैं, वो लहरी नहीं है। जैसा सूर्य की लहर होती है ऐसी प्रकाश की लहर नहीं है। इसलिए क्यूबिज्म में वही है कि लहर होता तो ऐसा बदल के आ सकता था किधर से भी प्रकाश, और हमको शैडो ही नहीं मिलती। वो सीधा प्रकाश आता है, इसलिए हमारे शैडो है। हवा जैसा लहर बदल का ऐसा घूमता नहीं अपने आजू बाजू में। ये भी जो एक नॉलेज हुआ, तब भी जॉर्ज सराट के पेंटर के माध्यम से हमको कण कण से पेंट करने का एक तंत्र मिला, जॉर्ज सरा हमेशा बोलता है कि कलर मिक्स करना बिल्कुल गलत है, क्योंकि मिक्स करने के बाद दूसरे जो कलर बोलते हैं वो अपनी किसी इंडिविजुअल पर्सन की चक्षु होगा सकता है, लेकिन कलर के साथ साथ जुड़ना है तो कलर शुद्ध कलर उधर होना चाहिए। उन्होंने कभी पैलेट नहीं यूज की, बॉटल से सीधा कैनवास के ऊपर तो रेड डॉट लगा दिए, येलो डॉट लगा दिए, हम उसको ऑरेंज बोल रहे हैं। ये जो कलर का जो है तेज का यूज कर कर पैलेट के ऊपर एक दूसरे में दूसरे कलर को समर्पित ना कर कर इंडिविजुअली उसको स्टैंड कर दिया, और हम उसको स्टिपलिंग बोलते हैं, लेकिन बहुत गलत शब्द है, स्टिपलिंग नहीं है। एक्चुअली वो कलर का पहला अच्छा पेंटर है कलरिस्ट, जिसको कलर का एज इट इज जिंदा रखा कैनवास तक, लेकिन विजुअल में उसका एलोशन दे दिया कि ये खाली ब्लू और येलो नहीं है, दिस इज ए ग्रीन। और एक ग्रीन कलर का विभक्ति कर दिए, उसका विश्लेषण कर दिया, तो ये दो ही कलर उसमें मिलते हैं। तो ये दो कलर उसमें बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है। और दूसरी मैंने जो प्रकाश की बात की है, जैसे पॉल सेजन ने उसी टाइम प्रकाश के ऊपर उसका थोड़ा ध्यान चला गया, तो उसको हर एक चीज़ में डायमेंशन नजर आ गई, और हम इसको बोलते हैं कि क्यूबिक वहाँ से स्टार्ट हुआ पॉल सेजन से। पॉल सेजन ने इतने कलर यूज किए, लेकिन कलर के लिए उसके ऊपर कोई बात नहीं करते। वो आर्टिस्ट को हम जानते हैं, दिस इज अ क्यूबिक का फादर। तो कलर से हम बहुत पेंटर को देख, क्योंकि जैसा भी अखिलेश ने बोला कि कलर के पीछे का तत्व हम नहीं जानते हैं, कलर के नाम ही जानते हैं, कलर स्कीम ही जाती है, जम गए तो मैचिंग, नहीं जमी तो आई कैचिंग। इतना ही कलर का स्वभाव है। और मुझे लगता है कि कलर तो पहला चैलेंज है पेंटर के लिए, कैसे यूज कर सकते हैं। तो इसको कोई आधार ले लेता है, जैसा अखिलेश ने बोला, स्ट्रेंजर मीन्स जो कर चल रहा है उससे हट के चले। काय को चाहिए पेड़ ग्रीन ही, येलो चाहिए, बल्कि एक आर्टिस्ट कर सकता है, पूरी कला अभिरुचि नहीं कर सकती है। उसके सवाल खड़े हो सकते हैं, लेकिन सवाल के अंत में उसका कोई आंसर भी नहीं मिलता है। होगा कोई ड्रीमी, होगा कोई साइकोएनालिसिस, लेकिन यूनिवर्सल पेंटिंग के बारे में जब हम बात करते हैं, किसी एक पेंटर का स्टेटमेंट सभी पेंटर के लिए यूजफुल नहीं है। यूनिवर्सली क्या हो रहा है, और उसके साथ कितना एक ट्रेडिशन पेंटर का, लोक फोक से लेकर क्राफ्ट्समैन आर्टिस्ट से लेकर पेंटर तक। पेंटर तो अपने पेंटिंग की समर्थन करते रहते हैं, उसको अपनी पेंटिंग की समर्थन करना कितना उसको मजा आता है मुझे पता नहीं। बड़ा दुख की बात है, तुम्हारा समर्थन हुआ और वो पेंटिंग कहीं म्यूजियम में चला गया, तो कौन है उधर समर्थन करने के लिए। तो यूनिवर्सली पेंटिंग को समर्पित करना तुम जानते नहीं है, तुम थोपते रहते हो। और पेंटर की सबसे मुझे अद्भुत बात रहती है, जो पेंट करते हैं, एग्जीबिशन करते हैं, क्रिटिसिज्म भी होता है, जब उनका इंटरव्यू लेना टाइम आता है, एब्सोल्युटली फिलोसॉफी कहाँ से लाते हैं पता नहीं। इतनी बड़ी फिलोसॉफी कभी उन्होंने फील भी नहीं की होगी, वो फिलोसॉफी बोलती है। तो ये पेंटर का रिश्ता कलर फिलोसॉफी के साथ नहीं जमता है, अपने पेंटिंग की फिलोसॉफी के साथ नहीं जमता है। तो कलर का क्या एक्ट है ऑन सरफेस के ऊपर। चाइल्ड जैसे कलर यूज करते थे, ऐसा हम भी नहीं यूज करते हैं, क्योंकि प्रकृति के बाद अच्छे कलर चाइल्ड आर्ट में ही पता चलते हैं। ट्राइबल आर्ट में तो मैक्सिमम ट्राइबल आर्ट पेंट नहीं करते, खाली बस्तर के और कुछ बनस्थली के लोग पेंट करते हैं। वर्ल्ड के पेंटर ब्लैक में ही काम करते रहते हैं ट्राइबल में, क्योंकि प्रकृति के साथ जुड़े हैं, उनके फॉर्म भी एक जैसे है। जैसे हम ग्लोबल आर्ट बोलते हैं, नहीं, ग्लोबल आर्ट, रियल ट्राइबल आर्ट इज अ ग्लोबल आर्ट। तो ये सभी कलर के साथ साथ बात करते करते मुझे ऐसा लगा कि मैं एक फॉर्म की भी मैंने तैयारी कर दी थी, वो भी मुझे थोड़ा आज काम में आएगी। मैं तेज और प्रकाश के बारे में बात करता हूँ, क्योंकि वहाँ से कलर की ग्रोथ है या बॉर्न प्लेस है। तो जब प्रकाश आता है तो कलर को नहीं छूता है, वो ऑब्जेक्ट को छूते रहता है। प्रकाश ऑब्जेक्ट के ऊपर आते रहते हैं, सरफेस के ऊपर नहीं आते रहते। लेकिन प्रकाश आते ही होता क्या है, छाया आती ही है। तो प्रकाश और छाया के बीच में कलर क्या कर रहे हैं। समझो कि रेड कलर के ऊपर प्रकाश आ गया तो रेड कहाँ रहता है, जो प्रकाश की बाजू है, और उसका इफेक्ट बोल के शेड के बाजू में भी तो रेड कहाँ रहता है। रेड दब जाता है प्रकाश और छाड़ों के बीच में। ये वास्तव रंग का रूप है, वो लोनली नहीं है, वो त्रिमित है। और त्रिमित में हम कलर का कौन सा अंग है, कौन सी मिति है उसकी ओरिजिनल, उससे दो मिति तैयार कर दी है। ये प्रकाश के साथ साथ चलता है। तो मैं जो आकार के बारे में बात करते रहता हूँ, तो मुझे लगता है कि ऑब्जेक्ट इज अ स्मॉल मॉडल। रियलिटी को समझना है तो पहले ऑब्जेक्ट को समझना चाहिए, और ऑब्जेक्ट के ऊपर प्रकाश आता ही है तो उसकी एक प्रतिमा आ जाती है, शैडो, प्रकाश के बाजू में एक प्रतिमा आ जाती है। ऑब्जेक्ट दो वे से प्रस्तुत होते रहते हैं। एक तरफ से बिंब का प्रतिबिंब, एक वस्तु का बिंब उसका एक प्रतिबिंब, दूसरी तरफ से वस्तु उसकी प्रतिमा और उसकी विलंबित प्रतिमा। तो विलंबित प्रतिमा मैं इसको बोलता हूं कि वो वस्तु जैसी बिल्कुल नहीं होती है। जैसे हमारे शैडो जमीन पे पड़ती है तो हम ये सिग्निफिकेंट उसमें हमारा मेरी शैडो ऐसा बोल नहीं सकते उसके ऊपर क्या है। वो कभी सादृश्य दिखाई देगी, कभी विचित्र से दिखाई देगी, कभी विरूप भी दिखाई देगी, कभी अरूप भी दिखाई देगी, और कभी अमूर्त भी दिखाई देगी। तो वस्तु में ही अमूर्त की शक्यता है, क्योंकि प्रकाश के थ्योरी के साथ साथ वस्तु अपने अपने में तो कुछ भी नहीं, अचल है। लेकिन दिस क्रिएट अ ड्रामा, एक प्रकाश और छाया ये वस्तु का ड्रामा क्रिएट करते रहते हैं। और उसको देखकर हम जब तक उसके जैसा नहीं आता तब तक सेटिस्फैक्शन नहीं मिलता कि शेड छाया। हमारा पूरा इंडिया का एजुकेशन है, जिसको शेड लाइट आता है उसको ऑब्जेक्ट आता है, उसको तुम्हारे जैसा पर्सन का पोर्ट्रेट भी आता रहता है। काम खत्म हो चुका। वस्तु को समझना यह कोई काम नहीं। तो मुझे लगता है कि जहाँ तक तुम विलंबित प्रतिमा तक जाता है तो वस्तु वहाँ तक अपने सोर्सेस दे देती है कि विलंबित प्रतिमा और विलंबित प्रतिमा एब्सोल्युटली तुम देखो शैडो प्लेस हो या कुछ शैडोज देखो तुम्हारे जैसी बिल्कुल नहीं दिखाई देती। तुमने हाथ पकड़ लिया तो वो पिकॉक दिखाई देगा, वो कुछ अलग ही प्रतिमा दे देगा। और एक प्रतिमा देखते बड़े विचित्र प्रतिमा रहती है, उससे हम डर भी जाते हैं, घबरा भी जाते हैं। मैं अगर 5 फीट का हूँ, सनसेट में मैंने देखा 25 फीट का हो जाता हूँ। तो ये जो प्ले है ये बिकॉज ऑफ प्रकाश। और इसलिए मुझे लगता है विलंबित प्रतिमा, जितने आज जयराम पटेल जैसे आर्टिस्ट हो, ये सभी विलंबित प्रतिमा, लेकिन वास्तव से बाहर नहीं। हमेशा एब्स्ट्रैक्ट आर्टिस्ट को सभी बोलते रहते हैं, अरे ये क्या करते रहते हैं, इनको वास्तव से कुछ लेना देना नहीं। तुम जितना कथ्य भरते रहो उतने तुम पेंटिंग से हटते रहते हो। जितने कथ्य पेंटिंग से, मुझे पता है कि चाय की किटली है तो बिना देखे मैं निकाल सकता हूं, लेकिन बॉल रखा तो मुझे देखना ही पड़ेगा कि क्या है, मुझे आता है कि नहीं। ऐसे ही सभी ऑब्जेक्ट ऑलरेडी पेंटेड है अराउंड यू, यूनिवर्सली सभी ऑब्जेक्ट पेंटेड है। एक व्हाइट चीज देखी वो भी तो पेंटेड है, ब्लैक चीज देखी वो भी तो पेंटेड है। तो पेंटिंग में ही हम पैदा होते हैं, पेंटिंग में ही हमारा सभी सोचना विचना होता है। लेकिन सभी को पेंटिंग की सेंस होती है, ऐसा नहीं कि वो एक आर्टिस्ट कलरिस्ट है वो कलर इग्नोर करता है। जयराम पटेल बोलते कि खाली ब्लैक में नहीं यूज करते, मैं बोलता हूँ कि वो तो विलंबित प्रतिमा यूज करते हैं। मीन्स ऑब्जेक्ट को इतनी दूर से इतनी अलग से उन्होंने ट्रीट किया कि उससे तुम्हारे कितने सारी इमोशन दिखती है। एक ही बात बोलता हूं मैं, जितने दृश्य के सवाल है वो आध्यात्म में उसका उत्तर हम ढूंढते हैं, उत्तर मिलता नहीं है। दृश्य का सवाल साइंस में मिलते रहता है। अरे पानी में एक लकड़ी पड़ी, वो टेढ़ी क्यों दिखाई देती है, सबको पता है। यह दृश्य लोगों के लिए चैलेंज है। एक्सप्लेन करो कि पानी में जो लकड़ी खड़ी है वो टेढ़ी क्यों दिखा रही है। इसके बारे में हम सोचते नहीं है। हम इमीडिएटली बचपन में ही सन्यासी की कोशिश करते, बड़े बड़े आध्यात्मिक फिलोसफी देकर पेंटिंग के ऊपर थोपते रहते हैं। अभी दूसरी बात है, ये ऑब्जेक्ट की जितनी कलर है मैं उसको अलग से कलर में देख रहा हूं। ऑब्जेक्ट को प्रकाश की जरूरत है, कलर को तेज की जरूरत है, अपना तेज। अभी 3 कलर लिया तो एक्सट्रीम तेज है लेमन येलो में, इसलिए उतने तेज के साथ साथ हम खेल नहीं कर सकते हैं। दूसरा है रेड, वो सबको पसंद है क्योंकि उसको मिडल में है, मध्यमा है। और तीसरा है ब्लू, ये जड़त्व है, मध्यमा है, चैतन्य है। वो प्रकाश के साथ साथ नहीं, उसकी अंतर इंटेंसिटी के साथ साथ उन्होंने हमको एक जगह पे रखा है। और ये तेज के मैं अनुभव बोल देता हूँ, जैसा मुझे जो बोलना है, विलंबित प्रतिमा की बात कर दी मैंने, वही है कि एक रेड कलर को उसके तेज के साथ साथ बिना आंख हिलाए उसके ऊपर कॉन्सेंट्रेट करो, 2 मिनट के बाद एक कोरे पेपर के ऊपर तुम्हारी आंखें शिफ्ट करो, तुमको एक इलोशन दिखाएगा, वो ग्रीन रहेगा, हल्का सा ग्रीन रहेगा। ऑरेंज करो, हल्का सा ब्लू आएगा। तो ये जो कलर है, मैं सोचता हूं ये कलर की विलंबित प्रतिमा है, क्योंकि बिल्कुल उसकी विरोधी आ जाती है। जैसा ऑब्जेक्ट का विलंबित प्रतिमा, बिल्कुल उसका ऑब्जेक्ट आता है। ऑब्जेक्ट इतना दाखों दिख रहा है, वो प्रतिमा भी आरूप है, अमूर्त भी है। तो यही कलर के साथ साथ मुझे अनुभव मिलता है कि कलर, ये विलंबित प्रतिमा को हम कंसीडर करते हुए कलर कभी पेंट नहीं करते। तो विलंबित प्रतिमा जैसा ग्रीन दिख रहा है, तो उसमें रेड भी येलो है, इन तीनों कलर आ चुके हैं। तो हमारे पेंटिंग के ऊपर जब पेंट आता है तो हम उसको रेड क्यों नहीं बोलते कि उसके संदर्भ में दूसरे कलर है, उसके विलंबित प्रतिमा भी है, कलर है, उसके स्पंदन भी है, उसकी ध्वनि भी है। तो हम खाली उसको कलर नहीं बोल सकते, उसमें मेरा कंटेंट रहता है, वो आशय है, मेरे आशय में वो कलर तरंगित होते रहते हैं, तो उसको मैं स्थिर नहीं कर सकता। और तरंगित हुई चीज, कंपन, उसको मैं एक टाइटल नहीं दे सकता। ये रेड है, और रेड अगर कंपन हुआ तो वो रेड नहीं रहता है, स्पंदित हुआ वो तो रेड नहीं रहता है। तो दूसरे का बहुत सारी चीजें, बहुत सारी सेंसिबिलिटी उसमें मिक्स हो जाती है। तो एक बात है जो कलर का मेरा ऑब्जर्वेशन है। और एक बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट चीज है, कलर पूरी पेंटर की दुनिया में वो इंपॉर्टेंट है। रॉयल एकेडमी के एक आर्टिस्ट जॉन टर्नर, इनके जो हम पेंटिंग देखते थे, एक समंदर के किनारे आकाश और समंदर के साथ साथ उनका हाथ में अपना रिसर्च होगा या उसके अटैचमेंट होगी, जो भी कुछ कहना है, लेकिन उसने मेजर पेंटिंग यही किया। तो मुझे लगता है ये कैसा है, आकाश, समंदर का प्रतिबिंब आकाश या आकाश का प्रतिबिंब समंदर में, उसमें कुछ भी दिखाई नहीं देते हमको। कलर की कहाँ रुकना है, कहाँ जाना रहे, कलर भी तरल रहते हैं, ऑब्जेक्ट भी नहीं है, वो एब्स्ट्रैक्ट भी नहीं है, वो बहुत सवाल खड़ा कर देता है। जैसा दर्पण में हम अपना प्रतिबिंब देखते हैं, लेकिन दर्पण के सामने दूसरा दर्पण रखा तो एक दर्पण दूसरे दर्पण में क्या देखता होगा, ये बड़ा सवाल है। ऐसे ही सवाल टर्नर के लैंडस्केप में होता है कि ऊपर आकाश है, नीचे पानी है, हम पता नहीं चलता कि पेंटिंग उल्टा है पिल्टा है, दोनों एक सूत्र से बन चुके हैं। लेकिन उनके ही एक स्टूडेंट अपने टीचर को, वो भी एक आर्टिस्ट थे, उन्होंने भी आर्ट टीचर थे, अपना ब्रश थोड़ा रखकर उन्होंने अपने टीचर का रिसर्च किया, एंड देन उनको फाउंड हुआ जो स्पेस की कलर है, वर्ण चक्र है, वो सरफेस आने के बाद बदल जाता है। हम बोलते हैं कि रेनबो, इंद्रधनुष स्टार्ट फ्रॉम येलो, लेकिन रंग चक्र स्टार्ट फ्रॉम येलो, सॉरी, रंग चक्र रेड से स्टार्ट होता है। इंद्रधनुष प्रिज्म से हम देखते हैं कि पहला रेड आता है, लेकिन वो स्पेस की बात है, सरफेस पे आते हैं तो कलर के तेज के साथ साथ, इंटेंसिटी के साथ साथ पहला येलो आ जाता है। तो यह जो थ्योरी है, जो जॉन रस्किन ने जब वो पेंटिंग से इंट्रोड्यूस कर दिया, उन्होंने दिया और उसके दिला, तो फिर से दुनिया भर का कलर नॉलेज बदल दिया। एकेडमिशियन तो हमें अभी तक भी वही सिखा देते कि पहले येलो कलर लगाओ और चक्र बना दो, लेकिन उसके बाद उसका क्या करना है ये नहीं हम बोलते हैं कभी। तो ये जो कलर के 2-3 चेंजेस है वो इसमें है आए। और दूसरा एक मुझे हमेशा एक अनुभव आती रहता है, जब पेंटिंग के बारे में सोचते हो तो पूरे रूप से नहीं सोचते हैं। जो भी चिंतन करता है पेंटर, वो फॉर्म के बारे में या कंटेंट के बारे में या अपना थॉट के बारे में, मैं क्या पेंटिंग करूँ या मेरी ट्रेडिशन क्या हो, इसके बारे में चिंतित होता है। लेकिन जो पेंटिंग स्टार्ट करता है तो कलर के बारे में नहीं सोचता है, क्योंकि वो सात सात कलर आपने ये साथ में, क्योंकि पहला पेंटिंग देखते हो तो पहला हमारी जर्नी होती फ्रॉम कलर टू फॉर्म टू कंटेंट। हमारे पास कंटेंट तक जाने की पेशेंस ही नहीं है। अगर मैंने अभी बोला कलर अगर आई कैचिंग हो या मैचिंग हो तो वही थक जाते हैं, कंटेंट तक जाते ही नहीं हम लोग। और कंटेंट तक जाने के बाद कलर एंड फॉर्म दोनों का रिश्ता ऐसा है, वन इज अ ट्रांसपेरेंट कंटेनर, अदर इज कंटेंट। अगर कांच में पानी भरा तो कांच का अस्तित्व हम नहीं देख सकते हैं, पानी ही भरा को देखेंगे। लेकिन वो ओपेक हुआ, उसमें हम कलर भरा तो कुछ भी नहीं देखते, वो फॉर्म को ही देखते बैठेंगे। तो कलर में ऐसा होता है कि कलर तो नैरेटिव्स हो, एब्स्ट्रैक्शन हो, लैंडस्केप पेंटर कोई भी हो, उनका पेंटिंग अगर उल्टा देखा तो हम पहले कलर देखेंगे, बाकी में उसमें क्या फिगर है, क्या स्टाइल है, क्या सब्जेक्ट है, वो देख नहीं पाएंगे। तो दो पेंटर है कलर से वो चेक करते थे, मुझे पता है। वन इज अमृता शेरगिल, जब अपना पेंटिंग करते थे उसमें उसके पेंटिंग में नरेशन से ज़्यादा कलर बहुत ही फ्रीडम है। और लास्ट में वो पेंटिंग उल्टा करके देखते थे, बाद में कलर चेंज करते थे, ये कलर इधर नहीं चाहिए, ये कलर में इधर चाहिए, ऐसा मीन्स कलर का सोच उनके साथ साथ था। दूसरे गायतोंडी जी, उन्होंने मिनिएचर किया पेंटिंग के, कभी किताबें पढ़े नहीं है, किताब आ गए तो उल्टा देखते थे। उल्टा देखने थे क्या, उसने तुमने क्या सोचा हुआ है वो मुझे जरूरी नहीं है, तुम्हारा क्या सब्जेक्ट वो मुझे जरूरी है, मेरा रिलेशंस ये कलर के साथ साथ। तुमने कलर कैसे लगा दिया, जम गई कि नहीं बात, जम गई तो जम गई, नहीं तो पेंटिंग फेल। तो आज के बहुत इनोसेंट अमैच्योर आर्टिस्ट भी ब्रह्मांड की फिलॉसफी बोलते रहते पेंटिंग के लिए अपने। तो मुझे ऐसा लगता है कि तुम्हारे अनुभव की कक्षा जरूरी है। अनुभव के कक्ष के साथ साथ हम कलर भी छू नहीं सकते, और रंग करने का जो आनंद है तो पुनरानंद है, वो जो अनुभव का पुनरानंद पेंटिंग करते रहते हैं। लेकिन ये कुछ नहीं है, ये थोड़ा पेंटिंग के टाइम थोड़ा सा हैपनिंग होती रहती है, वो हैपनिंग के साथ साथ हैप्पी है। ये सब मुझे लगता है कि मेरी मर्यादा है रंग के ऊपर भी बात करने के लिए। ज़्यादा ही मैं बात करूँ तो रंग पतला हो जाएगा। तो फिर से ये बात रखने के लिए रज़ा पर्व के माध्यम से मुझे यहाँ निमंत्रित किया, उसके लिए मैं बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद करता हूँ, और मुझे समझने की कोशिश की, इसके लिए भी आभार। थैंक यू।
अब मैं बनतन जी को बुलाना चाहता हूँ, वे आएं।
Namaskar and a very good morning to all of you, and thanks to the Raza Foundation for having me here. So I was just wondering from where to start on color, because when I myself start, do some work, I get a feeling that there is a force of color. That is probably the impetus for my own practice. So I'll be coming to color by understanding Ragmala painting in association with North Indian classical music. So I'll begin with the blending between sound and vision, which played an important role in terms of creating ragmalas. So when we say a rag, it's like it creates the colors of mind. So naturally that goes beyond that physical existence of color. It's not only the physicality of color. So how does it get created through raga and then get transformed? Because ragamalas are not the translations of those ragas which have been painted. And there are also many systems. of Ragmala paintings. So the paintings I have studied, I don't know which system they belong to, but mostly from 17th and late 17th and 18th century. So let me begin with understanding the space. A space is something, it's like a horizon from where all the sensors, all the sensibilities, they get generated. So for music, Naad is the causal force, the Karan Shakti. So Naad has two properties, Vayu and Agni. So, and Vayu is a quality of space. And Vayu has two attributes, sound and touch. So there are two types of Vayus, Ghosh and Aghosh. There's the struck sound and the unstruck sound. So when we hear a sound, it's not that all sounds are musical sounds. And music is also not an inborn sanskar of a person. So that requires certain deeds. So when we see Ghosh and Aghosh Vayu, and when we are trying to relate with Indian classical music, especially North Indian classical music, that we hear a lot of sounds at the same time. I mean, many sounds of different instruments, and especially the very ancient instruments like veena, venu, the flute, and mridangam, and the sound of voice. So sound gets created from Akash, from space. Then it gets a formation, the Vayu gets created, and then it gets a formation of the sound. And that sound gets segregated in a musical composition. And so there are many intervals, like the Shrutis in between the Swaras. The Shruti is, like, Shru means hearing, and Tin is something which is perceivable according to deeds. So Shruti is like where there is a possibility of visual perception that occurs in the experience of sound. So in Ragmalas, that we see, it's not only a miniature painting, but it falls under miniature painting tradition, but it goes beyond that. So where is the musicality we find in Ragmalas? So there is also a connection I see very strongly with Dhrupad. So in the Raga Chitramala, what we see that there are three musical interiors in the paintings. The four musical interiors. One is the segregated sounds which are there in the experience of the musical experience. And the conceptual constants, like how we use the swaras like Vadi, Samvadi, Anuvadi and Vivadi, like that. And then there is a kind of an embellishment of all those swaras. And fourthly, there is a possibility of synesthetic experience. So synesthesia is where two and more than two sensations, they work together. So from timbre, what gets generated from sound, and that gets translated into the texture of vision. So that lay, chanda, all over the rhythm of timbre gets into the visual segregation which are there in color, texture, and all over the structures. So formally, music is something, the form is very synchronic, interior it has. And because when we're hearing many sounds at the same time, like there is a kind of a diachronicity, diachronic ambience is getting created, and then suddenly there are layers of all those sounds and gets into this synchronic ambience of this music. So the enclosure of this form is sound, and that gets disclosed by rhythm, laya and chand. And another way, painting is the exterior is synchronic. Like we start probably from a patch and then we reveal one after another patches. So when an artist draws a line, it's not the line which gets drawn at that particular time, rather it's a kind of an experience which is there from over the years. So there are layers of lines beneath that line, that particular line. So there are many shadows. And that brings up the kind of a depth which is there in the line. So for painting, it's like the frame and the horizon that artist works on, and all the patches, they reveal that horizon and gets into the interior. So the synchronic interior of sound gets convoluted in the diachronic interior of vision, and the diachronic exterior of sound gets convoluted in the synchronic exterior of vision. So that is how this copulation happens. And not only music and vision, there is also a strong presence of poetry. So it's Ragmal is a combination of music, vision, and poetry, all three together. So in poetry also, this is temporal and spatial both. There is the enclosure is the meaning, and that meaning gets disclosed by language. So now, how do you understand language? Language is not only the tool that we speak, but language gives a space for the liberation of our thinking, our consciousness. So there is a term called Chetana Vimuktikaran. So it's a bridge between the form and the content. So the form it's not stretchable, it's vacuous, it's a region, it's not that Euclidean point, but it's a region, and content is something stretchable. So in between that, language plays a role. So the padas of Ragmala paintings and also in Dhrupad, they were written earlier in Sanskrit. But as many people didn't know Sanskrit and how to, then gradually that moved into Braj Bhasha and Nagari script, they were written. So Dhrupad also flourished during 15th century, late 14th and 15th century, and Ragmal also started at that time. So Dhrupad is something which is form. Dhru is form, which is invariant. Pada is like the four padas, that poetic embellishment of that. So that after studying the dohas and chaupais written on the Ragmala paintings, we could find that the 10 qualities of raga personification given by Narad in Naradi Shiksha, they're actually there. So they're like Rakt, the blood, where all these the sensations, the rasas, which are there, like mostly ragmalas are painted on the basis of Sringar. So in ragmalas, interestingly, Bhayanak, Vibhats and Hasya, these three rasas are not found. They are not there. Sringar, Raudra, Adbhut, all these, Shant, all these rasas are there. So Rakt is like the gross body, the presence of the gross body, which is with flesh. So with flesh, in a sense that if we say that the texture of the skin is not actually on the surface, it's because of the quality which is there underneath, within the body. So that embellishment of the sensas that happen in that rasas and that create actually this body, gross body. And then Alankar. Alankar is the ornamentation which is there in terms of the ascending and descending notes and how they are expressed in a raga. And Purna is like the entire body, that embodiment of the raga. And then Vyakt is expression and that tranquility of space in time. And then Sama is like the equanimity, like the relation between the sonic elements and the visual elements. All of them play together. So one is under another. And Vikrishta is the iconic feature, which gives the icons, like the characters in the raga. And then it comes Shukshma, is the subtle body. Then Sukumar is the entire beauty of that, the transformation of sound in vision. And then finally it comes into Madhuram. Madhur is like where the Sadharanikaran happens, depersonification. So it grows from somewhere in the sense beyond the existence of the physical body, and then gets into the formation and then dissolves. So this is the cycle. And there are many people who sort of related these ragmalas and the usage of different colors and space and structures, everything, in some way or other. But when we see this synesthetic association, I mean, there are mainly three types of swaras: Udatta, Anudatta and Swarit. The Udatta swaras are Ga and Ni. The pitch is quite high. Anudatta is Re and Ha, in the middle. And Swarita is Sa, Ma and Pa. So Udatta is associated with water, Jal. Anudatta is with Agni. And Swarita is with Prithvi. So the colors are also like Udatta is white, Anudatta is red, and Swarita is black. So that is something is given, but what I think it's not the color, not exactly black, white, and red, but the vibration of it. So when someone says there's black, may not be black, but the darkness may mean the darkness, the depth of the color, the volume of the sonic body. When one says that white, that could be like how a color flourishes in the air, in the sky. Like white always spreads all the colors. And red is like it has a kind of warmth. Probably it is related to that warmth, that it's a different vibration. So in this context, I would also like to bring this, like when we see a bright yellow in the nature. So we don't only see the bright yellow in the nature, but also see how it spreads in Vayu. So that is something is very abstract, and that is something, it's all pervading. It pervades everywhere. So with this capacity of that color, it brings the sense of touch, sense of sound, and interestingly, vision and sound, for both of them, objects need to be in distance. It's not the direct contact with the objects. So in Ragamala paintings also, when we see the spatial distribution of all the characters and colors and everything, they're in the rhythm. But one cannot say that rhythm is there in this particular tree or that particular tree or this particular image or that particular image. But it's sort of inserted in everywhere. And there is no saturated color. At least I didn't find any saturated color in Ragamalas. They're all unsaturated colors. Because when we say color saturation, it doesn't have more possibilities for dilution. So for unsaturated color, there are a lot of possibilities. And also the same raga is painted in different way in different schools, different school of thoughts also. But there is something which is invariant, is the quality of a raga. That is the structure, and that is where one can say that, okay, this is based on Rag Vairavi. So Rag Vairavi or Raga Vairav, they have certain characteristics which are actually sung and then painted. And when I spoke to people the musicians who practice Drupad, they were all in agreement that without having the existence of a form or the body, the singing of Drupad is impossible. That one has to invite that physicality, existence, the form within the music. But people who practice Khayal, many of them didn't agree. For them, it's not very relevant having association with color, time, everything, it's not important. So what I feel is, it's a very strong association with Ragmala painting, with the tradition of Drupad. So if many people get interested in future, then more works can be done on it. So finally, the color is in between, like what the debate what Goethe and Newton had. It's not only the light, but light and darkness. Both are equally important. And when we say the color of mind, there is no light. It's only darkness within mind. So how does one imagine? So there could be a color of experience, colors of imagination, colors of cognition. There are different kinds of color which goes beyond the color we see, and that is where in this synesthetic association many people associate colors with numbers, with days, all these things are there, and many neurologists, neuroscientists, they worked on this area. So I think that's it. Thank you.
तो अब मैं पीयूष जी को बुलाना चाहता हूँ। पीयूष जी।
मैं सिनेमा में सिनेमेटोग्राफर हूँ। मेरा काम है मोशन पिक्चर फोटोग्राफी। मैं फिल्म का डायरेक्टर नहीं हूँ, मैं फिल्में बनाता हूँ, पर फिल्म का भाग हूँ। और मैं जो भी करता हूँ दैट्स पार्ट, आई एम पार्ट ऑफ फिल्म मेकिंग प्रोसेस। अब रही बात कलर और सिनेमा के बारे में बात करना, या तो हम इस पे 7, 8, 10 दिन लगाए, बहुत ही मुश्किल है, बहुत गंभीर है, बड़े बड़े प्रश्न हैं। आज से कुछ 120 साल पहले ऐसे ही कोई छोटे से एक थिएटर में पर्दा था, लोग बैठे हुए थे, पीछे प्रोजेक्टर था, किसी को पता नहीं था क्या होने वाला है। प्रोजेक्टर चालू हुआ, आप सब जानते हैं मैं क्या बात कर रहा हूं। एक ट्रेन आई, लोग खड़े होके इस तरफ चले गए, डर गए। दिस इज अ वेरी symbolic pivotal moment in history of cinema. But I wonder, this train which came on the screen was in black and white. What would have happened if it was in color? पहली दफा वो देख रहे थे, किसी ने ये नहीं देखा था, किसी ने ये अनुभव, किसी ने एक्सपीरियंस नहीं किया था। और ट्रेन आई, अगर कलर में आती तो क्या कुछ लोग बेभान हो जाते, क्या लोग थिएटर छोड़ के भाग जाते, कि लोग कुर्सी में ही बैठे रहते, समझ जाते कि ये नकली ट्रेन है। ये सवाल के जवाब मेरे पास नहीं है, ये सवाल चलते रहते हैं। For me, the history of cinema, or the what is cinematic image, which came post long history of visual arts, from cave painting to painting, sculptures, and various other forms, theatrical arts, and suddenly a techno-dominant form comes. It starts in black and white, and I think this is, to understand color, this is very important. And cinema is now, we can say कि भाई 120 साल हुए रफली। मेरी हिस्टोरिकल नंबरिंग में कुछ गलतियां हो सकती है, 130 होंगे, 125 होंगे। 120 साल में 60 इयर्स तो हमारे ब्लैक एंड व्हाइट थे। कलर तो मेहमान है, अभी घर में आया है, घर का भाग बना है, रहने वाला है कि बाहर चले जाने वाला है, अभी तक हमें पता नहीं है। So that is how I feel currently we as a filmmaker have, and I'll present the kind of questions, issues, engagement we have faced while dealing with color. जब ब्लैक एंड व्हाइट आया तो सिनेमा फिल्म नेगेटिव की was very contrasting. हमारी आंख, our eyes can see what we call 28 stops of dynamic range, and this is geometrical progression, which is 1 2 4 6 1 2 4 8 16 32 64. ये 28 स्टॉप्स तक लेके जाए, हमारी आंख एक को भी देख सकती है और वो 28वें वाले जो करोड़ों अबजों में वैल्यू है उसको भी देख सकती है। जब सिनेमा चालू हुआ तो हमारे 3 या 4 स्टॉप की डायनामिक रेंज थी। ब्लैक एंड व्हाइट की हिस्ट्री में ब्लैक एंड व्हाइट बढ़ते बढ़ते वो करीब पेपर पे थियोरेटिकली 10 स्टॉप की डायनामिक रेंज पे पहुंचा। कलर आया, वापिस रुक के 7 स्टॉप पे हम आ गए, 6 स्टॉप पे आ गए। ये इस पे आता हूं मैं बाद में। सिनेमा की लैंग्वेज, सिनेमा का ग्रामर, सिनेमा की भाषा, सारा विकास ब्लैक एंड व्हाइट में। कलर जब आया तब सिनेमा ऑलरेडी अपना घर बना चुका था। उसकी बेसिक लैंग्वेज, बेसिक ग्रामर was set. Filmmaker had to integrate color in. And history of cinema is fraught with ample examples when the colors came. How filmmakers have faced problem of integrating color in their way of thinking. Now when we come to black and white, actually we don't see black and white. Black and white is a very, very artificial form. हम ब्लैक एंड व्हाइट में परसीव भी नहीं कर सकते, इमेजिन भी नहीं कर सकते। हम टोनालिटी में अगर हमें देखना है तो हमको तो स्कूल में सिखाया जाता, हम भी करते हैं, हम आंखें छोटी करके देखते हैं ताकि we can feel the lightness, darkness, gray, and that is how we try to feel the black and white. Feel the tonalities. So we formed a cinema's language in an extremely artificial expression. सुधाकर जी ने बताया कि ट्राइबल्स ब्लैक एंड व्हाइट में काम करते थे। I was thinking of Chinese and Japanese calligraphic artists who also worked on ink, which was nearly black and white or black ink and paper. But there was no black and white. So cinema started as a very strong potential art form. When the color came, what happened? Where did cinema and how did cinema grow? Or did cinema face problem? Personally, I have a feeling that our growth kind of became slower. Because suddenly we were engaging in a format, in a question, which was taking us away from the very powerful possibility which was lying within the idiom of cinematic expression. And when that train came, also one more thing happened. Cinema established that it is a realist, नेचुरलिस्ट मीडियम, इसीलिए लोग डर गए। सिनेमा में नीला आकाश नहीं है, अरे सिनेमा में रेड स्काई नहीं है, सिनेमा में ब्लू अर्थ करना बड़ा मुश्किल होता है, सिनेमा में कलर बदलना असंभव है। फिल्ममेकर्स एट टाइम्स स्पेंड more time researching a film, searching for location, so they fit within the color palette of the films they want to make. They may shoot a film for 2 months, but the research may last 2 years. It's visiting not only different locations, but finding the right light. And so cinema and color, for us color is a very naturalist expression. We don't have a choice. There was a singular moment which came much later on, which I will. Before that, I want to speak something about I think other people have also spoken on the nature of light, because the color is part of electromagnetic radiation, and we call it visible spectrum. I think it's a reflective visible spectrum, because what gets reflected, there is other part of electromagnetic radiation, जैसे microwave, infrared we feel as a heat, तो है, पर हमको दिखता नहीं है, हमें एक्सपीरियंस नहीं होता है, हमारे कलर्स में जो विजिबल स्पेक्ट्रम है। तो 1920s के आसपास आप कहीं पे भी गूगल करेंगे, इस चीज को किसी को अभ्यास करना है, एक एक्सपेरिमेंट हुआ थियोरेटिकल, पहले तो पेपर पे हुआ थॉट एक्सपेरिमेंट, और बाद में प्रैक्टिकली भी किया गया। इट्स नोन एज अ टू स्लिट एक्सपेरिमेंट, टू स्लिट लाइट एक्सपेरिमेंट, and there are ample YouTube videos and Google papers, some very scientific, some very basic. Two slit experiment में what they found is that I'm just picking the gist of it. What they found is that when we observe the light behaves differently than when we don't observe it. Now this is scary. And this is art. This is magic. And this is what actually we all our life are dealing with. You getting some my point? कि हम नहीं देखते तो it behaves differently. पर हम जब देखते हैं तो it collapses. Its behavior is predictable. तो ये जो पेरिफेरल आर्ट है वो तो नहीं देखा हुआ है ना, जो ये तो दिख रहा है बट है ये पर दिख नहीं रहा है। तो सिनेमा, तो दिस इज द वन एस्पेक्ट ऑफ टू स्लिट लाइट एक्सपेरिमेंट, बड़ा पढ़ने लायक है। दिस क्रिएटेड व्हाट वी कॉल क्वांटम मैकेनिक्स, एंड आइंस्टाइन ने तो ये कहा कि दिस स्पूकी एक्शन एट माइक्रोस्कोपिक लेवल, इट्स क्रेजी, यू कुडंट एक्सेप्ट इट। लाइट का तो एक और बड़ा इंटरेस्टिंग है कि दे डिड एन एक्सपेरिमेंट कि वन फोटोन ऑफ लाइट वेंट इन दिस डायरेक्शन, अदर फोटोन वेंट इन दिस डायरेक्शन, देयर इज नो वे दे कैन मीट एंड टॉक। जब उसको मेजर किया गया तो उसको बोलते हैं उसकी स्पिन स्टेट, पर लेट्स से उसको जब मेजर किया गया उसका जो रीडिंग आया इसका भी सेम आया। नाउ दिस इज स्पूकी एक्शन एंड द लाइट ट्रैवल्स एट अ फिक्स्ड स्पीड, नथिंग ट्रैवल्स फास्टर देन लाइट, पर फिर भी ये दोनों बात कर रहे हैं। तो ये है दिस इज दैट पार्ट। सो दिस इज कॉल्ड पार्टिकल वेव ड्यूअलिटी। एक पार्टिकल बिहेवियर है जो हमारे ऑब्जर्वेशन में आता है, और एक ये वेव ड्यूअलिटी है जो when we don't observe, the light has the wave duality, and wave as in a three-dimensional wave. The cinema is actually a process of projecting light on a screen. It carries the potential, theoretically. It carries the potential of creating an experiential world which is beyond what is being screened. Now for example, जब हम colors पे light, nature में light falls down and we see a red color, a blue color, green, yellow, mix, but what actually we are seeing is not ever a pure color, because light when reflects it kind of merges into each other, different frequencies. So any color we see, and that is what cinema does, because it's a naturalist realist, that it is seeing a layer of subdued layer of colors, multicolors, with a probably one or two dominant hues within that. Now from that world, because the cinema had a limitation of being naturalist, cinema went in terms of color aesthetic to the into the old classical mode, and which is primary, secondaries. So the color aesthetics of cinema, the film as what is got expressed, is always based on what we call classical color aesthetics. Aesthetics which painter and their domain gave up at a at a stage when cinema was forming, and they went in another dimension. But cinema में कलर ही आया 1960s में या 50s होगा, 50s 60s के बीच में आता है. And then, because of its naturalist, and let's not forget, cinema is an industrial art form. It's very expensive. So, जैसे एक्सपेरिमेंट करना बड़ा मुश्किल होता है. मणिकौल के साथ मैंने एक फिल्म की थी सिद्धेश्वरी. तो मैं बहुत नया था, मूंछ भी अभी आ रही थी. तो मणि जी का सोच था, एंड वो सोच को मैं थियराइज करने वाला हूँ और अपने विचार रखूंगा उसके बारे में. कि उन्होंने सोचा था कि हम कलर को क्यों इतना कंट्रोल करते हैं. ये कलर, वो कलर, ये कॉम्प्लीमेंट्री, ये होना चाहिए, ये लाइट होना चाहिए, डार्क होना चाहिए. सिनेमा में क्यों कलर आने दो, क्या होगा. और मैं तो बड़ा खुश हो गया, बिकॉज आई सेड दैट्स फ्री, यू नो, फ्रॉम माय टीचर टीचिंग मी, एंड आई सेड वाओ, मैं तो फ्री हो गया. तो हमने की फिल्म वैसे ही की. एंड व्हेन वी वेंट, एंड मणिकौल वर्कड ओनली ऑन ब्लैक एंड व्हाइट रशेस बिकॉज ही कुडंट अफोर्ड कलर रशेस. तो उन्होंने अपनी फिल्म कलर में देखी नहीं थी. जब फर्स्ट प्रिंट आई, फिर we both, probably me more, we were so depressed. I thought मेरा कैरियर खत्म, ये सिनेमा छोड़ना पड़ेगा. बोला इतना गंदा, इतने खराब कलर, इतना कलर की भेलपुरी, इतना सब कुछ. और मणि जी भी, और रात को ऑफ कोर्स आपको पता है शाम को बैठ के तो ज्यादा हो जाता है. तो वो चलता रहा 2-3 दिन. फिर इन 2-3 दिन में बार हमने फिल्म देखी. वो हम लैब में थे चेन्नई में. धीरे धीरे वो कलर हमारे साथ बैठने लगे, और अभी भी है वो फिल्म है, वही कलर है. और काफी लोगों को पसंद आई, काफी लोगों ने देखी. बट जब किया था, और इसके पीछे जो थॉट था, दैट इज मोर इम्पोर्टेंट टू मी. एंड द थॉट of freeing the cinema from the classical mode of thinking, because we have seen, as a cinema we have lived on a borrowed art. We have not evolved our own color theory, and technically our primaries are different than a painter's primary. But when we have to think of using colors, we have to think of painters' primaries and secondaries. When we are thinking technically, then my primaries are different, because my primaries are red and green and blue. Painting world में तो है नहीं वो, colors में तो है नहीं वो. तो ये भी एक संघर्ष चलता रहता था. मुझे लगता है कि what Mani ji was trying to do, it's my interpretation, was what I think 1920s, 1910, what Fauvist did. Fauvism, जो आप सब जानते होंगे, क्योंकि this is post Van Gogh, post, and Fauvist आते हैं और वो in a sense कलर को एकदम फ्री कर देते हैं. उन्होंने they decided to move away from their complementary theories, and they said we'll use any colors, we'll break away. Fauvism as a as a school didn't last very long. But the thought they generated, the energy and the question they generated is still there. Correct me, sir. It is still there because all our modern art, postmodern art, current contemporary work have in such incredible freedom of color, which Fauvism in cinema didn't happen, hasn't happened. I mean, we have to wait. We have to wait a Fauvism or an equivalent of Fauvist movement. It did happen in a micro मात्रा में जब म्यूजिक टेलीविजन आया अमेरिका में. It was called MTV. Beginning था. And suddenly shocking, colorful, violent, vivid images. वहाँ रेड स्काई होता था, वहाँ सब बदला जाता था, and it became extremely popular. So, and before that, a little bit of what we call underground cinema attempted a movement from breakaway from color. But living apart, color is still a difficult and how different filmmakers have handled, like Ozu, who practiced Osimaro Ozu, Japanese filmmaker, who practiced 1925 onwards till 60s, 65, 70s, I don't know. और उन्होंने फिल्में बनाई both black and white and color. वो तो zen master है, zen master की तरह सिनेमा बनाया उन्होंने. ओजू का जो कलर काम है, हमें फर्स्ट देखते तो we get a first feeling we get is that it is filled and imbued with Japanese sense of color. But somehow I found that there is something magical more to it. So one day I did an experiment. I took his color film. मैंने टीवी में जो कलर का बटन था, वो सैचुरेशन करके कुछ नॉब होता है, उसको 0 कर दिया. और वो फिल्म को मैंने ब्लैक एंड व्हाइट में देखा. And that film was as good. If somebody had given me that film as a black and white, I would have been fine. So that leads to the next question: is cinema color and that cardinal relationship with black and white still necessary? I think it is necessary because cinema is light and shade. The filmmakers who have managed to retain the artificiality and hence artisanal quality of black and white within their color have achieved but purely color work because cinema has an advantage of time. You can take a shot, white wall, white this, and suddenly cut to a red. And cinema is such powerful, but it's very, very few filmmakers. Many have done it. Tarkovsky attempted in a different way. Ozu did it in a most spiritual way or meditative way is the right word. Bergman kind of lost his edge when it came to color. Michelangelo Antonioni became very experimental while making a film called Red Desert. So, and in contemporary cinema, there are so many filmmakers. It's a big list. But someone whom we can all access it is available on one of the OTT platform, and whose cinema, who makes a very a different kind of world, is a filmmaker called Wes Anderson, and his film called The Last Dispatch. is on the, and he is the one who deals with color. And he makes a cinema imbued and suffused with color. But that's a one way of seeing it. I don't have much to say. There are thoughts. This Fauvism, MTV, in that sense, cinema still has a long way to go. We have reached an age of digital technology, of post-production, where so-called naturalist, realist movement, image, we can layer them with a very low intensity, different shades, different hues, and that also in a low range, mid range, high range. It is still being experimented, people are experimenting, and when they experiment, they only work in a complementary colors. Like the one very famous look is called teal and orange. Now teal and orange, that is complementary classical colors. So it's being done. I hope with this new technology, we may have a very evocative, sensual color as an independent voice within cinema and not as a information filler. Thank you.
तो मैं अब छत्रपति दत्ता को आमंत्रित करता हूँ.
I think today I would like to take you back little more than 100 years to come to my context, because my context deals with Abanindranath and the context of color in Indian modernism, which means that we will have to dispose ourselves to a time when we are completely in the folds of colonialism. We are already completely dominated by colonial rule. We have to realize that all our little kingdoms and large kingdoms have been already taken up and gobbled by the imperial power. We should also realize that along with that, I'll need some light here, please. I'll need to read. I'm not so proficient in speaking. So we'll also we have to be aware that we are in a space where all these craftsmen, all these artists were nurtured around in all these small kingdoms and the courts of the Rajas and the emperors are completely out of place because these courts don't have the power anymore. And even the small schools that were operating all over India have no longer the connections that they made with society and thus displaced. Which also means that they are having to move to the bigger and newer form cities all over the country. They are having to find livelihood in spaces that never existed before. So this displacement itself, of course, as you all can assume, also displaces them from their cultural roots, from their practices, as well as from the ambience in which they were happy and existed in a more homogeneous situation. Thus, when these growing cities were happening, it is very evident, and you all know, that it was being replaced culturally by European practices. One of them dominantly being the use of oil paint, which then came in through the art colleges that were formed initially by the British rulers in 4 major cities of the country, and then the sort of geography of the country, one being in Lahore, one being in Bombay then, one in Madras, and one in Kolkata. So these art schools, which began around the 1840s and were already established by the 1960s, completely dominated the practicing part of the art world. As we would know that initially these schools were formed not for creating artists, but for rather creating draftsmen and people the establishment administration needed to provide for their needs of either creating maps, topographical references, or even ethnographic studies, as well as drawing plans and city plans and town plans, as well as construction plans. But gradually these institutions began to have teachers, mostly of course from the Kensington School, which was then the prominent school in England, and also coming from the Jeshua Reynolds tradition, as you would all know. The importance of Abhinavnath actually, I think, begins from there, from the trajectory of this Indian history, where there is a complete lack of understanding and nearly forgetfulness of all the Indian traditions. There is a crisis gradually developing in the 1890s, and which is, on the one hand, to do with the need for completely on the political side, a need for autonomy, people realizing that they need more independence, thus the Swadeshi movement brewing up on the one hand. On the other hand, the whole situation where the colonial rule had already been able to establish a sort of British academic practice in all the art institutions. And oil painting, as you all would know, is the most powerful medium in the world established as far as visual arts and painting is concerned, which could translate as closely as reality and thus become a parallel to possessing. If there was an object of a still life, only after oil painting did it have the power of projecting a still life in a way that if it hung on your wall, it would be something that you would be actually possessing. Similarly, what was brought in then was, of course, the portraiture, painting of portraiture, which became so important, and thus academic practices also growing in importance. People placed highly in society were in great need of having portraits of themselves made. So all these practices becoming so important is when Abhinavnath comes into the scene. Sorry for the long introduction, but it was necessary to come to the context. Sir, it's too much from you. So by then, like always, as we know, can we go to the next? Abhinavnath is brought up, as we all know, in an ambience of the Tagore house. And thus, we see the first picture is where Rabindranath, who is his uncle, is assisting or possibly singing a song where Abhinavnath is playing the Esraj. Abhinavnath, on the one hand, because of the ambience that he grew in, was was open and exposed to poetry, literature, music, and visual arts together. And this ambience, of course, gave him a lot of freedom to move around these arts, and he has tried nearly all of them, has become, if not a proficient writer, possibly one of the most powerful users of the Bengali language and creator of children's literature, which is equally as much adult literature as it is for children, and it is possibly one of the magical uses of the Bengali language of that time. So we see also Abhinavnath with Nandalal, possibly on Abhinavnath's birthday. So he was also blessed with students at the art college who were as great as Nandalal and many others of his time. But the problem, but the problems of the Boito Khan, I'll just try to again establish the ambience in which Abhinavnath was. Of course, a much later work. This is a work by Ram Kinkar, Nandalal Bose, who is right in front and making a drawing. We see Kumarsamy trying to correct his drawing. We see Gagan Thakur there and we see Rabindranath right at the end, possibly taking an afternoon siesta. So this is the ambience of leisure and freeness within which Rabindranath really existed and practiced. It will also sort of tell us about how difficult it would be for Rabindranath as a growing artist at that time with so many powerful influences, because Rabindranath was always standing like a wall behind whatever Rabindranath did, and was a staunch supporter of anything that Rabindranath could think of. So in spite of that, to be aware of the needs of the time, to be aware of a cultural crisis, and to find a way out possibly is a lesson we still need to learn today in today's time as well. So next, we'll come to the problems of the Dakshinir Veranda, which I have already talked about. Dakshinir Veranda is the southern veranda, which was active space for the Tagore house, and especially the brothers who were close friends as well as associates, who basically were Rabindranath, Gaganendranath, and Shobarendranath, who practiced parallelly on the Dakshinir Veranda. And it was this discourse through which Rabindranath grew up, moved in phases between different interests, vocal and instrumental, music, acting, and stage decor, in the plays staged by the Dramatic Club of Jorashako, and the poetry and play readings in the informal art club Khamkhiali Shobha, which, if you know a little bit of Bengali, Khamkhiali is trying to say you can be what you want, or so go as you like Shobha, where you could sort of be yourself, set up by Rabindranath in the 1890s. During 1895 and 1896, with Rabindranath's encouragement, he wrote his first 2 storybooks for children with his own illustrations, Shakuntala and Khirer Putul. I will leave this part for now and come to the next slide. But as usual, however gifted you are and however great an ambience you are brought up in, you also have a basic to start from, like everybody has to do. Rabindranath's basic practices with visual language started with illustrating poems and stories, which were then continuously published all over Bengal, some from the Thakurbari, others from other publications that were becoming important then. Next. And like always, in the beginning of the 1980s, he was also influenced by his cousins, also interested at that point of time to really be able to paint and draw, as they would call it, like making a good portrait or painting a good landscape. And thus he sought the tutelage of the vice principal, then vice principal of the government college, forgetting his name. Gilhardy. Gilhardy, being the vice principal, was also one of the most famous portrait painters of that time and taught many practitioners at that time. So he went to Gilhardy and learned portraiture, and these were the beginnings where you will see the clear indication of European influence and of sketching, the chiaroscuro, the basic perspectives. Next. And also tried his hand in oils, which he quite mastered, though by then he had already realized that he needed in his narrative and in his text to be more grounded to his reality. So, and of course to mythology and parallel histories. These were spaces Rabindranath always dealt through all over his life. So this is basically large oil painting done by Rabindranath, which is of course the birth of Sita, which where Sita is actually being discovered through the plough and Sita is born. So these were also phases that Rabindranath went through. Next. and वो वहाँ रहना पड़ेगा भाई साहब को. So also, as this painting of his grandfather would show, that he had mastered the portraiture to an extent which even Gilhardy said that he was a master of pastels by then. But it wasn't only pastels, there are oils as well as watercolors where the, the proficiency of Rabindranath as a portrait painter was highly established, and he was then satisfied, which parallelly Rabindranath never could, and always kept saying that he wasn't ever able to draw a portrait, though we do not need to compare the level of these artists, but this is the extent of Rabindranath's portraiture. But there begins the new journey for Rabindranath, which I think again by the inspiration of Rabindranath and wanting to first, for the first time, create a really Indian style painting, went back to the Geet Gobindo and tried illustrations of the Geet Gobindo next. Though this is not that, this is the next series. The Geet Gobindo remained to be illustrations and not paintings, and also heavily influenced by European illuminated manuscripts. But when he attempted the Krishna Lila pictures, it suggests a closer affinity to the Delhi miniature paintings which he had encountered and attempted at recreating an Indian style. The most distinguished features of these paintings lay in the delineated patterns. Next, patterned gold borders and the intricate calligraphy in red and black. That is what the artist had valued most in the English book illuminations and Indian miniatures, and what he most carefully cultivated. A full set of his manuscripts of verses from Geet Gobindo, where he evolved an ornate Persian-style script for Davangiri and Bengali. Next, as you can see, this is of course a close-up of the larger frame. Each of the frames have scripts along with them. This is Krishna trying to entice Radha, dressed as a female. I'm not going into the narrations, but next, if we look at what the palette and the first, next, or we could, even if you remember the previous frames, what Rabindranath was trying to do was not engage much with the basic format, but make it simple and always deal with complementary colors. We could go back a bit, few frames, please. So the first attempt in watercolor, please go back. Piche. You will see, when you see, look at the larger frames, piche chaliye. You will see that the basic compositions are always balanced with complementary colors. There is the blue on the one hand, the warmer yellows on the other, and either there is the blue and the red, which is constantly complementing. And though they are, and the use of elongated figures, possibly taken from the Ajanta and the other Indian miniatures, but much more lucid in terms of drawing, in terms of articulation of the compositions, more naturalistic in that sense. Chaliye, aage chaliye. And basically brings in the Geet Gobindo to us, maybe as a reflection of the Rajput and Mughal lessons that he was trying to learn. Next, chaliye. Another close-up, next. But the initial masterpieces actually came after this. And this is when Rabindranath is really being capable of mastering what he has been trying in the assimilation of all these lessons of the miniatures, as well as Persian art, Art Nouveau, and as well as the folk influences that he was trying to incorporate. Next. The first of these was the building of the Taj, which is, all of these paintings that you will see now are made between 1900 and 1903. So it is just the beginning of Rabindranath, and by which time he is also getting recognition as the master painter of India. The first painting, the building of the Taj, which was sort of followed the euphoria of the Krishna Lila series. He remembered a phase of complete engrossment with this new kind of work when his mind constantly teemed with lines, forms, and colors. He consciously insulated himself from all Western pictures in fear of contamination. He felt he was being swept away from a wave of by a wave of change. As I felt the tug of the wind, he wrote later, I tore out the ropes and flung myself in. I let the boat float in the face of the current, get rid of Western art. I now look up Indian art. This also coincides, incidentally, with his coming in contact with the great E.B. Habel, who becomes principal of the Government College of Art and Craft in 1896, gets in contact with Abhinavnath in 1897, and by then Abhinavnath also considered beyond Palmer, who was his watercolorist teacher, and Gilhardy, rejects both of them to make E.B. Habel his guru, because E.B. Habel by then, who was previously for 10 years in the Madras school, had already developed a complete idea that the European education and its patterns was completely irrelevant in the Indian context, and that Indian artists and people should be made aware of their traditions. And he had already begun work in that direction, documenting ancient monuments and recording architectural sites. Thus, this was a boom for and a great privilege for Abhinavnath to have got a guide and a philosopher like Habel, who guided him through, and these paintings, which were then taken to Delhi Darbar exhibition, actually won several awards, but all this done by Habel himself and Habel's initiative. Actually, these Mughal series itself was inspired by Habel, who insisted that he should not only try and adapt the Mughal miniature style, but also try and talk about Mughal history, which was what Abhinavnath was trying to do. Next. So, the building of the Taj and the passing of Shah Jahan, which we will see a little later, was sent by Habel to Curzon's Delhi Darbar exhibition of 1902, I think, in 1903. These two in between, these were also paintings that accompanied that exhibition. And here we see a very clear sort of Mughal style coming into practice, but also in them the Art Nouveau elements, as well as the practice of a single figure that was sort of visualizing a passage. This is called the Traveler and the Lotus, visualizing a passage on the autumn season. And the more famous Obisharika that we'll see a little later, symbolizing the spirit of monsoon night. Both paintings are marked by a new reticence and simplicity. The narrative condensed into single figure images placed in in open space. The figures themselves register a more distinct presence, but figures were conceived primarily as embodiment of a literary mood and ideal, as metaphors of the romantic emotions of love and separation, hidden desires and yearnings. The absence of a definite physical locale in the compositions underlined the primacy of a timeless idea and emotion. So we see that in terms of color, instead of going to complementary, he also now is trying to experiment with a single tonality where tone itself sort of could bring in the required emotions that he needed. And since by then he was also very consciously trying to capture seasons, which we will also see later, that most of them are based on time, on a particular season, whether or not it is directly evident in the naturalistic landscape used or in any other elements. It is always in the emotive, like this is the autumn and next is the monsoon. So he clearly sort of converts color into a more abstractionist use, where it does not speak in terms through the forms that he uses, but speaks in the overall ambience of the presence of the visual itself, nearly a sort of abstraction. I mean, if you could remove the fine lines around the Obisharika, who is on the one hand out there trying to find her lover, fragile as well as frightened. If you remove those sensations, this becomes a beam of light in the monsoon night. So this sort of abstraction was possibly playing already in Abandranath's mind while creating these images. Next. We come now to the one of the greatest masterpieces of that time. Though Abandranath was very conscious of use of material and color, this incidentally is one of the greatest examples of oil painting that he did, which is on a wooden panel. It's not paper, it's not watercolor or wash, which the initial look of the painting suggests as if it is a sort of a tempera or a wash painting. It is not, and really speaks about the proficiency of Abandranath in the use of oils. And again here he constantly uses the complementary position where there is a sort of a very palish foreground. There is the darkness of the blue and complemented by the interior. Of course, this is the passing of Shah Jahan, which incidentally sort of coincides with the passing of his daughter, and the relationship of father and daughter, the pathos and the complete inner emotion possibly helped or possibly is what Abandranath at that point could relate with the passing of Shah Jahan in sort of contrast. It was the painting which epitomized the illusion of bhava into Mughal pictorial conventions, painted in oil on wood but condensed to a scale similar to the miniatures. It shows a remarkable adaptation of the oil technique and delicate details and meticulous workmanship of the miniature compositions. A deep personal dimension to the relationship of father and daughter and the theme of impending separation. This was the pith of the bhava jojanam, the intensity of feeling which the artist added to Mughal technique of the painting. In his reminiscence about this picture, Abandranath would analyze how his use of colors and images were intended specially to augment his emotive quality. He felt that lines and defining the boundaries of the form limited and restricted the meaning of a picture, but color in its boundlessness could convey hidden depths and suggest a range of abstract ideas and emotions. A painting, he said, may need to be stripped of its outer trappings of beauty to allow its inner reserves of emotions to manifest themselves. The passing of Shah Jahan was regarded as the first test case of the manifest of these ideas in his paintings. Compared to a Mughal, I'll leave that part. Its appeal lay lodged in between its obvious resemblance to a Mughal miniature and its subtle departure of style and ambience. So this is the Abandranath we find in 1903, and as Abandranath now comes next to the art call, joins the art call. This is one more of course, his wash paintings. By then, he's already acquainted with Okakura and a few other Japanese painters who came in, students of Okakura whom he had sent later, which I will come back to. But this is, of course, the Meghadutam, and one of the, again, fine examples of the use of complementary colors. Next. And the great Bharat Mata, which I must speak a little about, because this is also one of the most important iconic works that Abandranath created throughout his life. And it clearly sort of reflects the the influence of the Calcutta school at that time, which Taikan and Hasida Shunsho, the two painters that Okakura had sent back, were collaborating together with Abhindranath and his other students to create this fine technique of wash that I will just try to describe. Both of the aesthetics and the form of Taikan style would leave its strong impressions on the work of Abhindranath. The first time he watched Taikan painting on silk with pale watery ink, he remembered his disappointment with the strange lack of color or substance in these pictures. But in time, his eyes learned to appreciate the very subtlety and sparseness of Japanese painting. It was through his observations of Taikan soaking his paintings with the water that he evolved his method of wash painting. After a preliminary drawing, layers of color wash would be applied, each coat following by a dip of the paper in water and drying out to allow the tones to become darker and deeper. At the end, the form would be touched up by fine lines and modeled out through a few highlights. But the abstraction of mood and emotion were conveyed through the very specificity of form and color. I will come to Bharat Mata here. Abhindranath rejected all the narrative and theatrical structures of academic painting. Instead, as in this painting, stories were condensed. I'm sorry, we are not talking of this painting in particular, but works done during this time, condensed into mood pictures, deliberately deleting details of time and space within an imagined ambivalent mental zone. In general, solitary figures floating in misty, undefined spaces. It was this combination which produced one of the most important paintings of the artist in the wash technique, the picture of Bharat Mata, more than any other. This painting firmly fixed the epithet nationalist to his recreation of an Indian style. This image of the motherland, conceived by Abhindranath as Bongo Mata, came to stand at Bharat Mata, encompassing the wider entity of the nation. To Nivedita, this painting was the supreme example of the way the abstract ideal of nationalism could be metamorphized into form and cast into an image that was both human and divine. It was precisely this dual impression of intimate familiarity and divine transcendence, the role of daughter, mother, and goddess, all merged into one, which Nivedita also emphasized, which seems to lie at the heart of the appeal of this picture. In painting it, Abhindranath was conscious of creating, for the first time, a new artistic icon for the Indian nation. Am I taking too long?
You are, but go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, I'll try to be a little, go through a little faster. Next. So this is Abhindranath joining the Government College of Art and Craft in 1905 as vice principal by the invitation of Havel, of course. And this is where another journey begins for Abhindranath. And all his lessons, by then, of course, all his great students were by then spreading all over the country by 1910, of course, not as early as 1905. But what was happening was the Indian school, the Bengal School of Painting was already acquiring importance all over the country, placing a sort of very important strategic point for the nationalism that was growing up and the indigenous becoming an alternative, though there was also a large sort of percentage of artists who were already drawn to the Western academic style and who rebelled strongly when changes in the art school were brought in by Havel as well as Abhindranath. where Havel, by 1896, had already created new curriculum. He had by then planned to remove all the Western paintings which were there in the Indian Museum, of which at that point the principal used to be the curator of the painting gallery, and replace them by buying in miniatures from all over the country and creating a new gallery through which students could be inspired and look back at the Indian history rather than fall back on the Western history that had happened. So next, the next series, these are little important works that I need to just point about to talk about the language which was gradually, which Abhinavnath was actually being gradually able to develop, where his solitary figures remained, but I think the height of the emotion was completely emphasized, an ambience of mood and mystery over the following years. This quality of myth, allegory, and fantasy would weave itself into whatever theme Abhinavnath painted, even themes from his immediate environment. In this painting, an intricate naturalistic study of a weary camel lowering its burden is bathed in a glow of rust and orange and transformed into an allegory of depth. To the artist, the camel becomes the symbol of the lower, long-suffering devotee waiting for his union with God. A delicate miniature painting of his aged mother, which is also done during this time, reflects the similar sort of mood and miniaturist style. Next. This is also one of very rare works done by Abhinavnath, where we will also notice that Abhinavnath does not get caught up in any stylistic, structural, formal, or colorist manner. And he is constantly evolving and experimenting with space as well as language, where color constantly becomes a dominant influence in his language. So this is, of course, Rabindranath, Gandhi, and Andrews, who are very naturally discussing national problems of that time. Next. We come to the next phase, which is one of another completely new phase of Abhinavnath's works, which take Abhinavnath further into himself and discovers himself anew. Next, throughout the series of landscapes, except for little of the Shahjadpur, which you will see after a few slides, where color plays a different role, but his initial works in Puri as well as other Munger were completely devoid of color, nearly black and white, but possibly he was also trying to experience space, and through space, trying to sort of create at the same time a sort of a narrative in space. Next, where you will see that he has drawn frames and which are titled Puri to Konarak. See, he's talking of two spaces in two different frames, but with nearly a minimalist line passing through the horizon, but also giving a sort of indication of two different locations. Both Swargadar and Konarak for me are not just spaces for Abhinavnath, but rather two locations where he finds complete different emotive values and have different connections to him. Comes to its climax after several of these drawings to the next work, where there is neither Konarak nor Puri temple. It is only space and a wind that is blowing up taking and blowing away a bit of the sand into the sea. So which side would be Swargadar and which would be Konarak? Who would reach whom at which end? Possibly he leaves for us to decide, but for him, I think, as far as my reading goes, one of the greatest abstract works that he has created, giving a very specific title. Next. We're coming to the Shahjatpur landscapes here. The years also saw Abhindranath making some of the first forays into nature and landscape studies, into bird and animal paintings, and impressions of the sun, the moon, and waters. The Puri Konarak series of sparse brushing sketches with their tiny crawling forms of people, temples and trees are inevitably associated with Rabindranath's childhood memories of the ghostly starkness and the loneliness of the coastal scenery that he encouraged in his trips to Konarak and Puri. The most evocative of Rabindranath's landscapes are those of the Shahjatpur series, painted during 1925 and 26 on their trips to the Zamindari estate of East Bengal. The wash technique is used here with optimum effect, compositions soaked in water and bottle bloated images and evanescent blends of blue, greens and yellows capture the full feel of the East Bengal riverine rain-washed environments. Next. And its relentless monsoons. At the same time, the all-pervasive sense of water, rain and mist. Next. Mist removes from these landscapes the specificity of the physical locale and renders them into dream pictures. Next. I often think that this painting would be no less a landscape which we just mentioned by one of the speakers, is of the great landscape artist, I'm forgetting his name, Turner. So I think this is no less a Turner than, except for it was painted in Bengal. A close-up of that train coming in also resembles one of Turner's bridge paintings, which I'm sure Rabindranath had experienced by then. Next. This, I will leave the landscape here with this work called The Grave of Maghdum Sahib. The grave we can see far off. We can see a person in front of the well drawing water. Possibly Rabindranath is trying to talk about the traveler who is on his last journey with all his baggage, visiting a tomb, as if seeing the reflection of himself and trying to sort of draw the last bit of life's water that remains in the well of life. I will leave the landscape here and next just go into the beautiful and most famous series by Rabindranath called The Arabian Nights, before which, of course, there were several other series which I have skipped for this lecture. As I understand, it is already too long. Next. So, as we all know, the Arabian Nights is about Sherazade trying to escape the Khalifa's sort of wrath of beheading a virgin every night after he had spent the evening with her. So when it was Shahrazade's turn, it was her trick of telling stories. Rabindranath uses this context during the night, and unfortunately and very greatly, this whole series of more than 40 paintings was done in a span of 1 year, which was 1930. We'll go to the next work. As you will all see, he is nearly assembling his whole life's experience of color, form, and narration into these works. And none of these works, though they are all titled according to the stories of the Shahrazade of the Nights, they are not either illustrations of the work, nor do they even resemble the formation of the stories. What they are an artist's interpretation of the story itself. Because for him, the idea of creating these paintings is to talk about a storyteller, where possibly he is replacing himself to find his way out of the trap that he is in. So possibly Abhinavnath himself finds a metaphor in using the Arabian Nights as an alibi to talk about himself instead of really talking about the Arabian Nights, as we will see that. Next. So when we see, this is possibly the Wazir and the Shehrazade and the younger sister down there. The Wazir is dissuading the Shehrazade to go to the Khalifa, but we see that Shehrazade has a book in her hand, in spite of the fine sort of clothing she wears and the jewelry. There are also books in the background, and the sister who is standing in front, possibly entering, it also has a book in her hand. So somewhere, possibly Abhinavnath is indicating to knowledge, to wisdom, and to the text which can take him beyond and take the Shehrazade. Shehrazade's argument also is that I have the art of storytelling, and I will take this art, make me across the difficulties that I will face, which is somewhere a nationalist parallel that Abhinavnath is drawing. Next. I would just show them as examples of the various compositions and color formats that Abhinavnath used, where they are not repetitions, they are unique stories which often also change spaces. Often they move even in terms of country, and locale often are completely neutral, or they take you to a land which could be real, which could be identified, at the same time could be not present at all. Next. This is one of the finest works of the series, which is called The Fishbone and the Hunchback. So we see how Abhinavnath again gets into talking of color and locating color within the city of Calcutta, within the environments in which he grew up, and which he, as a child, which he writes about a few years before he paints this, that when he was a child, he used to look out of the veranda and see the theater that opened up in front of him through the bisti, to the gatekeeper and passerbys of the Jorashako house, which created a drama for him. It was possibly the study of those dramas, those theaters, which Abhinavnath actually reconstructs throughout his life. And here we see two theaters happening at the same time. One is possibly where this old man was given a fishbone in his food, and then he nearly chokes to death. So the tailor and his wife are trying to sort of bring him back to life by lifting his leg on the one hand and trying to pat his back. And this is a sort of a crisis he creates in another setting, put in a much brighter light, where it is a dining scene. There is a watch clock which says it's 2 at night. The glasses are still full, so the evening will carry on. But most importantly, Abhinavnath locates himself there as a man with the pipe, with his cigar, and he most definitely talks about this as a Tagore house, because the painting, which is half covered with the pankha that you see, the white patch in front, you will see the turban. I should have brought this in greater detail. We see the turban of Dwarkanath on top, and we see the rest of Dwarkanath seated, and which was a painting which always hung in the Tagore house, which Abhinavnath had experienced throughout his childhood. So he's talking of two parallel situations where he himself, being part of the Tagore house now, is sort of entertaining English guest who are having dinner, though he is not having dinner himself, but he is placing these two situations in contrast to the little happenings downstairs, which is one of those people with a Gandhi toupee is possibly opening a bird's cage and there is a cat peeping in. So these narrative parallels are always things he's trying to connect. And finally, we also see that the Union Jack flies on the top. Abhindranath talks about Kurt, Tagore and Company, which is one of the Argonath's first companies where he believed that the British collaboration with India in terms of business would really be good for the country, which possibly is one of the critiques that Abhindranath is making through this work. Next. There are these details. So, so this is the lower portion, and next is where we see the real one of the scenes where something consciously done could turn into adverse situations, and then next is where he talks about the dinner. So these are the basically three settings that Abhindranath creates these layers from bottom to top. Next. So that's the full painting again. So coming back to one of the other famous stories, which is Sinbad, where we see that Sinbad is not talking of his great voyages, but Sinbad has traveled through the world. So Sinbad actually metaphorically brings people from all over the world together to tell his stories. We will see the Chinese, the English, the Persian are all listeners of the Sinbad stories. And what Sinbad here is possibly Abhindranath himself with the books in front of him, the knowledge he's trying to share that he has gathered through his life to the world, not to one individual or to one listener, but people from all over the world who assembled to listen to Sinbad's stories. Next. This is the last frame of the Arabian Nights, which I will be showing. Here, it is not a part of the Shehrazade stories, but it is depicting Shehrazade herself, telling the story to Khalifa in a very illuminated space and with the beautiful architecture behind. So what possibly Abhindranath is trying to say here is that Shehrazade is narrating stories night after night to save herself. And telling a story means you need to imagine. So imagining is very important, and to be able to imagine means to be able to have freedom. So possibly what Abhindranath is trying to say to us during that time of the 1930s, that you need to imagine freedom, you need to be telling these stories of freedom, and to be in captivity is where freedom comes through stories, comes through imagination, and that is what the Shehrazade is trying to do, and possibly that was what Abhindranath was also trying to do. Thank you. I'll leave the presentation here for now.
Thank you, Chhatrapati. Now I invite Kumar to speak. Final.
Thank you, Akhilesh, and of course everyone else who are all my friends who say they still want to hear me in spite of feeling hungry as well.
A bit near.
Yeah.
Yes.
Virtually all the problems that we face have, in a sense, been addressed by the speakers who spoke today, all of them practitioners and eminent ones at that, and learned people. So there's very little that is left to me to say. In fact, it was also preceded by learned people who spoke about form yesterday. So I'm grateful to all of them for bringing forth, as it were, not only something from their own experience, but also something which they are sort of troubled by. That is, they don't have the answers. And throughout, I have felt that anyway, we can't have those answers, because like the very fundamental difference that took place between Goethe and Newton, it's not resolvable. So whenever anybody addresses those same issues, in a way we are addressing the same issues. There's nothing new under the sun, in a way. Any assertion which makes for a statement that I know, like I know that Ashokji is wearing a blue-green kurta, or he is wearing a saffronish, very dangerous color, gerua or whatever, I begin to wonder whether how can we dare to even say that, because actually they don't exist, We make them what they are and name them such. This seems to be again and again coming up, and it was there, you might have noticed, from the beginning, when Akhilesh spoke about the revelation that Raza Saab brought to him, that colors matter at all, and that they have names, that they have to be found, or they reveal themselves. Because Picasso used to say that he never searched, he just found. And this is a problem with us as thinking human beings, that we even resent revelation, unfortunately. Because colors reveal themselves, And that doesn't mean that we should leave them as they are. Obviously not. The energy that emanates from color, as like the energy which emanates from darkness. He said all he did for a whole year or two, or how many, I don't know how many, was to sort of enter darkness, to find the source in black of all colors. A friend of this very famous thing that has happened over the last few years is that one of our most famous artists, Anish Kapoor, has patented the black. And it's created a hell of a furor amongst other artists. But last time I met him, he said, I've had to pay for that black myself. So what can I do? It's a particular material, which he has bought from the British Defence, which yields that black. So it's a huge, huge problem. And if we accept revelation and things like that, whether it be from a technological technological experience, let's say, or from nature itself. That means with no intervention of culture, then we are falling into a problem. We have to question our revelation. And if we do not question that revelation, we will fall into those traps that the consumer society and our so-called civilization is subjecting us to. So constantly we have to, like Freud and Marx, I know they are over a century or two old, but we have to return to them to question the very basis of our civilization. Can we begin even to call ourselves civilized, considering what is happening today in the world, and specifically here, where the revelatory qualities of every religion, of every experience, are actually being turned into qualities of oppression. It has happened before in history, and it will continue to happen, I guess. But so far, we have been able to find a way out. This time, like Ashok was asserting very much yesterday, even in the private conversations I had with him, it seems that it'll be very, very difficult. Very difficult. I know that when it was happening in Germany, that it is now about, like I said, more than 80 years ago, that people did not realize that the guilt of consenting to be passive citizens survives to this day. Just very recently, two young artists, they are not filmmakers, but they are two aspiring filmmakers, two young artists, came to my place through the agency of Amrit Gangar, friend critic, film critic from Bombay, and he sent them to me. So I did not know what they were going to ask me, show me, but because Amrit had told them to meet me, I said, of course, come and meet me. So they had freely chosen to make a kind of video on some person over there. They're artists. And so their aspiration to be a filmmaker is a continuation of their art. It's not like in my case. I never wanted to be an artist or a musician. I wanted to be a filmmaker, and that's what I have tried to practice through my years. So anyway, it was evident that the most significant thing to them that emerged from just one individual that they were talking to was a sense of guilt, which the person they were interested in, they found very mutely conveying it to them. Because being artists, they did not rely much on the word. They relied more on the image. And So, what I think we have to mostly veer towards, if you like, for the time being at least, is to find out how all of our faculties are being destroyed. It's not just what is happening in front of our eyes and ears and fingers and all the senses are now being destroyed. And without those senses, or the indriya, the chitta also will not exist. It is not possible. So there's a control over all our senses which will prevent us from even acting on our belief of ourselves, of being ourselves. At least we should have that to be able to survive this catastrophe. And one after the other, those kinds of things are happening. And I must say that a person long ago, when I just joined the Film Institute, who I used to meet at a coffee house, we went to a coffee house the other day here. It's the swankiest coffee house I've seen in my life, with the one in Bhopal. But there was this coffee house where I used to meet a person working for the defense laboratories in Pune at that time. And he pointed out some certain things about technology which I had not heard then, and I haven't quite ever been able to further his insights rather into the technological world. And one of the greatest insights he had given to me was that the speed for which, at which, the little thing which moves the film and which creates in the camera, it moves in a certain way and then it is projected later in a different way. The speed can create amnesia, for example. That means that the mental processes are affected through merely a question of how many frames a second that a film is projected at. And it's hardly spoken of most of the time. And with the new forms of projection, emission of light, etc., the effects on the nervous system are quite extraordinary, and we do not know exactly what they are doing. We only know the symptoms from ourselves, and those symptoms then get internalized by linguistic structures. And the linguistic structures then impose themselves mostly through the manipulation of image and sound and language now openly, which ban you from certain modes of thinking. They restrict you, they enslave you. And again, it's not happening only now. In fact, it has happened in a different way earlier, and regimes of what we had been calling medieval or whatever you want to call it, too old, etc., had imposed it. One of the things that probably Picasso very deftly understood was that people had asked at the time of the French Revolution to be allowed to dress with the color that they wanted to dress in, you know, and they had been banned from thinking of such libertarian ideas. Now, the French Revolution, I think, promised them that you can dress the way Josephine or King Louis XVI were dressing. But they had acquired their freedom to dress the way with those colors, etc., through the Palace of Versailles, which was created by an earlier king, Louis XIV, who wanted them to be imprisoned there and succeeded in imprisoning those people and then gave them that freedom to dress as they liked, you know. And of course, they dress outrageously, horribly, you know. They had no sense of color because they had lost it through this imposition that that was made earlier by religion, by Christianity and Islam and so on. And therefore, one of the most wonderful things that happened while I was working with Bresson and he was dropping me home, and I asked him a question not related to color, but rather to this whole question of realist representation. I didn't even ask him about realist representation. I asked him because he was one of the 3 persons approached by Hollywood through an Italian big budget producer, I think Ponti, whether he would do a version of the Bible. And so in that context, I asked him what did he think of Rossellini, who was equally known for being a Catholic voice in Europe. So Bresson said, well, he gave a tangential answer. He didn't say what he thought of Rossellini or what would Rossellini make of the Bible. He said, j'aime le spectacle, means I love spectacle, you know? So, and you know, Bresson was known to have actually been the most austere filmmaker of the kind that he cut out visuality in that sense, you know. So I was delighted when he said that, because in fact he was once again going against the person who has spoken the most within that tradition to which he belonged, or Pascal and so on, was St. Augustine. St. Augustine was an African, a Moor actually they say, who was peripatetic, always moving around, and who's almost like seeking annihilation in the manner of the Sufis, you know, and the Buddhists. And so that austerity was there, and he was against spectacle. So this was very well chosen that he said, I don't go with that at all. Even that. And it shows the contradiction that we always face with color, you know. So color is, I think, when he was making his first color film at that time. Uniform Dus was his first color film. And through all that and other things that happened, of course, I understood the very basis of how finally, different areas of the world. You saw some of that in the last presentation, Abanindranath, struggling, to find a native, so to say, idiom of color. It's a big struggle. And it was unnecessary in a sense. Had it not been for the imperial presence in India, we would not have thought of a native response to it. We would have been confident that our personal response, personal, private response, if you like, even, is adequate. Had it not been. And there was no need for creating this false idea of the nation state, which his brother, of course, Rabindranath, addressed so beautifully, even through his, which Charadhyay deals with, actually. Then his nation state is a falsehood to start with, So let us really keep on rediscovering color, and the sources can be from many, many, many cultures, and many, many, many historical events and discoveries, and let us meet the challenges, because which this present day decivilizing process is imposing on us. And it is imposing not only on us, it is imposing it on the imposers. I spoke about this problem when what I thought was a personal problem, I realized it has now become a universal problem. When I had made Khayal Gatha, I had to refuse an offer of some 20 lakhs or something of that kind, because the person who was buying it from me said that in the subtitles, you may not use a subjunctive. This was 1989 or 1990. The person was saying, I'll pay you. So it's a television channel, it wasn't a person. So we'll pay you this much, will you not have any subtitles, which are using the subjunctive? And I said, but how can I do that? There cannot be khayal without the subjective. My whole film is in the subjunctive mood, So how can you say such a thing? And of course, the emissary of the thing was a friend. So I lost that friend also, along with the money. Then, many years later, I met Bresson's wife. We hadn't met for 40 years when I met her. And it was also about 15 years after this experience that I just told you about. And she said, Kumar, do you know that the subjunctive is not being used at all in French? So I said, my God, how is it possible, I thought they were telling me out of some eccentric, racism, that you may not use the subjunctive. Some 15 years before that. So then, of course, I'm today obsessed by this. that everywhere I have to say this, you please allow me to do, and thereby all the other people who speak the languages that I know a little, including French, please allow us to speak and think with the subjunctive. Now, subjunctive does something wonderful. It gets together the past, present, and future into the same sentence. The subjunctive is a way of praying. It's a way of speaking your desire, you know. It's a way of being yourself, you know. So if you don't allow it, you're going to make life very difficult for everybody. But they are saying that they are suppressing the subjunctive, those who are actively doing so, that is because it's a difficult mode to adopt. I began thinking of other things. So in a very similar way, we had suppressed the dual in Sanskrit studies, you know. Sorry to trespass on your grounds, but anyway, I was very agitated about it. And when I don't know Sanskrit, I'll never know it, but I was speaking to Eisenstein's Eisenstein Museum curator. And he sprang up in surprise and tried to show me some references that I had only 2 days in Moscow, and he used to not sleep and meet me and all that kind of thing. A wonderful man, the only socialist man I've ever met in my life. And he showed me references where Eisenstein was trying to include it in his image making for films. So when I talked about all this to a human rights activist, he said, we are also being told by the United Nations not to use the subjunctive on grounds of democracy, because it's difficult to handle. And I told him, as well as everyone else, that it is not difficult to handle. People can make mistakes with it, you know. But it is the language, and one person told me, quite a young person, told me that you don't meet enough poor people. And she was a European woman, you know. So I said, look, I think I don't know, you must be a very special person living in Holland, and telling me that I who live in Delhi and Bombay, and I travel by the local train, that I don't meet enough poor people. You must be living in some fantasy, another fantasy of poverty. I don't know what it is, you know. But they speak to me. I thrive on the speech that I get from them, the signs of life. And they all compulsively use a subjunctive. They can't but do that. Because all that they have to live with is their prayer, their wish, their desire to improve their quality of life. So they have to use a subjunctive. How can you stop it? You know? So the lie is growing bigger and bigger, and we are accepting the lie, whether it's through visuality or through words. And so we will soon become dysfunctional. And we will hand over, if we carry on this way, everything to robots. So we must find a way of saying our prayers, if nothing else. Thank you.